I reached the cabin late in the afternoon after a long drive on a narrow dirt road that twisted through thick forest on both sides. The trees stood so close together that I could barely see past the first few rows. Their shadows covered most of the road and made everything look darker than it should have been for that time of day. My hands felt tight on the steering wheel from the rough ride, and my whole body was sore from sitting for so long, but I kept going because I wanted to reach the place before it got dark. I had rented the cabin for 3 days, hoping to get away from all the noise and stress of my everyday life. I wanted quiet, and the cabin looked like the perfect spot because it sat alone deep in the woods. When I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, I felt a mix of relief and uneasiness. The cabin looked old but strong, made of dark logs that seemed almost black in the fading light. The roof looked worn but not damaged, and the small porch had a single wooden chair sitting near the front door. The place had a stillness that felt heavier than normal quiet. I turned off the engine, and the sudden silence made me more aware of my own breathing. There were no sounds of cars or people. Even the birds seemed to be holding their breath. I stepped out of the car and stretched my legs, feeling the cold air press against my skin. The temperature had dropped fast, and I could smell damp earth and pine needles. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground as I walked toward the cabin. I carried my bag and a small cooler, taking slow steps because the clearing was uneven and full of little dips hidden under layers of leaves. I noticed faint marks on the ground near the edge of the trees, like tracks or signs of something being dragged, but I didn't stop to look closely. I was tired and just wanted to get inside. The cabin door opened easily when I pushed it, and the inside smelled like old wood and dust. I flipped the light switch, and a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered before staying on. The main room had a small table, a wood stove, and a narrow bed pushed against the wall. Everything looked simple, a bit worn down but clean enough. I set my bag on the bed and looked around slowly, trying to adjust to the new space. The windows were small and covered with thin curtains that barely moved even when a breeze passed through the cabin. I walked to the window near the bed and pulled the curtain aside. The forest outside looked even darker now, the trees blending together into a solid wall of shadows. I noticed again how quiet everything was, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the woods, feeling like the trees were staring back at me. After settling my things, I decided to gather some wood for the stove because the air inside the cabin was already getting cold. Behind the cabin stood a small woodshed with a stack of dry firewood. I grabbed a few pieces and carried them inside, noticing how my breathing was louder than usual in the empty space. I placed the wood by the stove and lit a small fire using the matches left on the table. The flames caught quickly, and the crackling sound made the cabin feel less empty. I sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed my hands together, trying to warm them. The fire helped, but the cold still lingered in the corners of the room. The shadows on the walls moved with the flame, making it look like the room was shifting around me. I didn't like that feeling, so I stood up and walked around the room again, checking the small bathroom and the tiny kitchen area. Everything looked normal, but for some reason, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my chest. As the sun went down, the forest outside turned completely dark. The windows showed nothing but pure blackness. No moonlight, no stars, no distant lights from any other cabins. It made the cabin feel more isolated than I expected. I moved around slowly, trying to keep my steps quiet even though no one was there to hear them. My own caution made me feel a little silly, but I couldn't help it. When night fully took over, I decided to eat something simple from the cooler. I sat at the small table and ate slowly, listening to every tiny sound. The cabin creaked every now and then as if settling into the cold. The fire popped softly. My fork scraped against the plate. That was all. Outside, nothing. No wind, no animals, no leaves moving, just complete silence. I went to the window again and pressed my face close to the glass, trying to see anything outside. All I could make out were faint shapes of trees, but even those were hard to see. It felt like the forest had swallowed the clearing whole. I stayed there for a long time, staring into the dark for no real reason other than a strange feeling crawling up my spine. When I finally backed away from the window, I felt a cold shiver run down my arms. I decided to get ready for bed even though it was earlier than I usually slept. I wanted to lie down and rest because the long drive had drained me. I changed into warmer clothes and climbed into the bed, pulling the blanket over me. The mattress was firm and made a faint crackling sound when I shifted my weight. The fire still burned softly, but its light barely reached the corners of the room. As I lay there, I stared at the ceiling and tried to calm my breathing. I told myself I was just tired, that the cabin was safe, that I was alone and nothing was out there. But no matter how much I tried to relax, the feeling of unease stayed. It wrapped around me like the cold, settling into my body in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Minutes passed, maybe longer, I wasn't sure. My eyes grew heavy, but every time I felt myself drifting towards sleep, something inside me tensed. I kept listening for sounds, even though I didn't expect any. The silence was too complete, too heavy. It pressed against my ears until I almost wished for something to break it. Then, just when I was finally starting to relax, I felt something. Faint vibration, not a sound, not a movement I could see, but something changed in the air. I opened my eyes again, staring into the darkness above me, trying to understand what I felt. The cabin seemed still, but my body reacted before my mind did. My heart started beating faster. My breathing turned shallow. I pushed the blankets aside slowly and sat up, feeling the cold rush back over my skin. The air felt different, denser, heavier, like something outside had shifted. I turned my head toward the window, even though I couldn't see anything through the darkness. My body stayed tense, waiting for something, though I didn't know what. And then, just barely, I heard something. Not loud, not clear, but enough to make every muscle in my body lock up. I drove up the narrow gravel road that led deeper into the hills, farther away from the main highway than I had ever been alone. It was late afternoon when I reached the cabin, and the place looked older than the photos online. The wooden walls were darker, stained by years of weather. The porch leaned a little to one side. The trees around it felt too close, their branches hanging low like they had grown unchecked for a long time. I stepped out of the car and felt the cold air wrap around me. It was sharp and dry, like the kind of cold that settles early and stays long after the sun is gone. The rental description said it was a quiet and private cabin, surrounded by untouched nature. That part was true. The silence felt so strong that even my footsteps on the wooden porch sounded too loud. When I pushed the door open, the hinges let out a slow groan. Inside, the air felt dead still, like nobody had walked through in years. Dust lay in the corners, and the wooden floor had a dull, worn look. But it was just a simple cabin, nothing strange. A small kitchen, a table, a single bedroom, and a bathroom that felt colder than the rest of the place. I unpacked slowly, taking in every corner of the cabin. The windows were old, with frames that rattled slightly when the wind moved around the house. The trees outside seemed to block most of the daylight, so the inside felt dim even before the sun started dropping. I didn't think much of it. I just wanted a quiet place for a few days. I wanted to breathe air that didn't smell like the city, to hear something other than cars and crowds. I didn't expect the quiet to feel heavy. By the time I finished putting my things away, the sky was already turning a deeper shade of blue. I made myself a simple meal, ate at the small table, and listened to the faint cracking noises coming from the wood as the temperature dropped. After cleaning up, I stepped outside with a jacket on, planning to get a bit of fresh air before the night settled completely. The forest was darkening fast. The tree trunks looked like thin black lines stretching upward. I could smell the cold earth and the old leaves. The gravel under my boots shifted with each step. I stayed close to the cabin because the darkness felt thick. When I turned to head back inside, I noticed something odd near the tree lean on the right side. It wasn't a shape or a shadow, just a patch of darkness thicker than the rest. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just sat there like something absorbing all the light around it. I stared at it for a moment, telling myself it was probably just the way the trees were grouped or the way the light hit that area. I tried not to read too much into it. I headed inside and locked the door, The chill in the air felt stronger now, pressing against the windows and walls. I turned on the single small heater in the bedroom. It gave off a faint hum and a weak bit of warmth. I spent some time reading on my phone until the battery dropped low. I set it aside, crawled into bed, and lay there listening to the quiet. The cabin made soft noises, the kind old wood makes as it shifts with the temperature changes. For a while, I felt comfortable, but then I heard something outside. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was a sound like something brushing lightly against the side of the cabin. A slow scrape, then a faint shift of gravel. I lay still, telling myself it could be an animal. The forest had plenty of wildlife. Maybe something small had wandered close, confused by the scent of food earlier. The noise came again, a slow, dragging sound, not like an animal walking normally. It moved in short, uneven motions. I held my breath without meaning to. The sound traveled from one wall of the cabin to another, like something circling the place. Then it stopped. I waited, listening to the silence crush the space around me. After maybe 10 minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe the wind had pushed something across the ground. The heater's weak hum made it easier to settle my breathing. Eventually, I drifted into a light sleep. I woke up hours later to a sudden, sharp noise, not loud enough to shake the cabin, but strong enough to shock me awake. It sounded like something hitting the porch, maybe a footstep, maybe a heavy object dropped. My heart thumped hard against my chest. I lay still, trying to calm my breathing. Then came another sound, slow, steady pressure on the wooden boards of the porch. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal's quick movements. It was deliberate space steps. The boards creaked under weight. I stared at the dark ceiling, afraid to move. The footsteps moved across the porch, then stopped right outside the front door. The silence that followed felt unnatural. The heater's hum sounded far away now, like it wasn't even in the same room. I waited for something else, a movement, a breath, anything, but nothing happened. After several minutes, I forced myself to believe it had been some kind of animal that had wandered up before leaving again. I stayed awake a long time before sleep finally caught up with me. In the morning, I stepped outside carefully. Frost covered the ground, giving everything a pale, washed-out look. I walked slowly toward the porch. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I saw the markings on the wooden boards. Long smudges, not shaped like shoe prints, but more like wide streaks left by something dragging itself or something being pushed. They ran across the porch and stopped right in front of the door. I crouched to look closer, but I couldn't make sense of the shape. It didn't look like animal tracks or boot prints, just wide, uneven marks that had disturbed the thin frost. A cold feeling washed through me, but I tried not to jump to conclusions. I went around the cabin to see if there were more signs. On the side near the bedroom window, the frost on the ground had been disturbed in a thin, curving line, like something had moved slowly close to the wall, too close for comfort. I stayed outside for several minutes, scanning the treeline. The forest was silent. No birds, no movement, just a still quiet that made the cabin feel even more isolated. I told myself maybe a wounded animal had dragged itself around, looking for food or shelter. That idea made me uneasy too, but it was better than thinking of something worse. I spent the rest of the morning trying to distract myself. I went inside, kept the lights on, made some food, and tried to read. But the cabin felt different now. It felt like the walls were thinner, like the windows didn't block anything. Every small sound made me look up. By afternoon, the sky was turning gray, and the wind picked up. The trees swayed slowly, their branches bending and scraping against each other. I didn't want another night like the last one. I thought about leaving, but the idea of driving down the narrow road in the dark made me hesitate. I told myself I could handle one more night. I just needed to be more prepared. I checked the lock on the door. It felt solid but old. The windows had weak latches, but I closed them tightly anyway. As the sky darkened, I felt the tension sitting in my shoulders and stomach. I tried distracting myself with small tasks. Boiling water, cleaning the counters, folding clothes, anything to keep my mind from wandering. When night fell, it happened fast. The dark outside looked heavier than the night before. I could barely see past the porch. I left the small lamp on in the bedroom and lay down, fully awake. I listened to the cabin settling, to the heater humming, to the faint wind outside. Hours passed. Then it started again. A faint shift of gravel. A slow brushing sound against the lower wall of the cabin. I felt the air in the room change. My body tensed automatically. The scraping sound moved along the wall, slow and uneven, just like the previous night. Then came the steps again, soft, deliberate pressure on the porch boards. The sound moved right up to the front door. No knocking, no attempt to open it, just a presence, heavy and close. I stared at the bedroom ceiling with my heart racing so hard it felt like the mattress vibrated beneath me. The porch creaked lightly under weight. Then silence. It stayed silent for so long I started doubting my own senses. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe my brain was twisting normal forest sounds into something worse. Minutes stretched. My breathing slowly returned to normal. And then it happened. A slow, steady pressure against the front door. Not enough to break it, not even enough to shake it, just a firm, testing push. Like something was feeling the door, checking it. I lay frozen, every muscle locked. The pressure stopped. The silence returned. The night dragged on without another sound. I didn't sleep at all. When morning light finally came, I walked outside again. My legs felt shaky. The cold hit me instantly. I stepped onto the porch, and my stomach tightened. The frost was disturbed again. Long streaks, uneven lines, almost identical to before. But this time, there was a section where the frost had melted slightly, as if something warm had pressed against the wood. I walked around the cabin. Near the back wall, I found more marks. Something had moved around the entire structure during the night, leaving a faint trail in the frost and dirt. I didn't know what kind of animal would behave like that, if it was an animal at all. The pattern didn't make sense for wildlife. It moved too close to the cabin, too deliberately, circling and stopping in specific places. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, locked the cabin door behind me, and drove out of the hills without looking back. The road felt longer on the way down, the trees pressing in close on both sides. I kept expecting to see something in my rearview mirror, but nothing appeared. When I reached the highway, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The air felt different, less heavy, less sharp. I drove home and didn't tell anyone what I heard or what I saw. I convinced myself it was an animal acting strangely, or frost patterns creating illusions, or the old cabin exaggerating every sound. But even now, I know what I felt. I know the difference between an animal searching for food and something moving with intent. I know the difference between random footsteps and deliberate pressure. The marks on the porch didn't look like they came from paws or hooves. They looked like something wide and heavy dragging itself in slow motions, stopping only to rest weight near the door and walls. I have gone camping again since then. I have been in forests and mountains many times, but I will never rent a cabin that deep into the woods again. Not alone. Not where the trees block the sky and the silence feels too thick. Because I can't forget the sound of something circling the cabin in the cold darkness. I can't forget the weight on the porch steps. I can't forget the slow pressure on the front door. And the part that stays with me the most is this. Whatever was out there, it never tried to break in. It never made noise for attention. It just moved slowly around the cabin, staying close, studying the walls, learning the sounds I made, testing the strength of the door, and waiting in total silence. Almost like it had all the time in the world. And if I had stayed one more night, maybe it would have come closer. Maybe it would have pushed harder. Maybe it would have found a weak point somewhere in that old cabin. I will never know what waited outside. But I know this. Something was out there. And it wasn't just passing through. It was interested in me. And I left just in time. I had been looking for a quiet place to clear my head for months. My job kept me stuck in the same loop every day, and my sleep had become a mess. When a coworker mentioned a small rental cabin far out near the end of an old logging road, I didn't think much of it at the time. But when things got too heavy at work, I decided I needed a break and booked it for 4 nights. The pictures online made it look simple and peaceful. A small wooden structure with a metal roof, a wide porch, and thick trees all around. It looked like the kind of place where nothing ever happened, and at the time that sounded perfect. The drive there felt longer than what the directions suggested. I kept losing cell service every few minutes, and the road got narrower the deeper I went into the woods. I watched the forest close in around me, the tall trees leaning inward, their branches stretching over the dirt road like a roof. I kept checking the fuel gauge even though the tank was almost full, as if some paranoid part of my mind expected something to go wrong. I didn't see any other cars after the first half hour. No houses, no open land, no signs of other people. Just miles and miles of rough dirt road with ruts deep enough to make the suspension complain. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I felt a bit of relief. It wasn't big or fancy. The boards on the outside looked old. The windows had wooden frames that seemed weathered from years of storms, and the metal roof had spots of rust. But the place looked stable enough. The forest around it was thick, but the clearing gave just enough open space to make the cabin visible from all sides. A narrow path curved around to the back where a small shed stood with its door slightly open. I assumed it held tools or firewood. Inside, the cabin felt quiet in a way that made the air seem heavier. There were only 2 rooms. The main living area with a small wood stove, a table and a bed against the wall, and a small bathroom with an old sink and a dry flush toilet. The cabin had no electricity, only a battery-powered lantern on the table and a few candles tucked in a drawer. I noticed scratches on the floor near the door, thin long lines that didn't match the shape of any animal claws I'd seen. I told myself it was probably just old furniture being dragged. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle into the quiet. But the silence wasn't peaceful like I hoped. It felt too strong, like something pressing against my ears. Even the wind outside barely made noise. The trees hardly moved. I kept expecting to hear birds or bugs or something, but the forest stayed strangely calm. I tried to ignore it and made myself busy collecting small branches and sticks to get the stove going later. When the sun finally dipped behind the trees, the clearing darkened quickly. The shadows got thicker, and the outside started blending into one giant black mass. The cabin didn't have curtains, so I could see the outline of the treeline clearly through the windows. Every time I glanced through them, I felt like something was just out of view, like something was waiting for me to look away. I lit a candle and set it on the table. The dim yellow light made the room look smaller. I sat on the edge of the bed trying to read a magazine I had brought, but after only a few minutes, I felt a strange tension start building inside me. I kept lifting my head to scan the room for no reason. My body felt restless, like it knew something was wrong before my mind could put anything together. The first night passed without anything major happening, but I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, some small noise pulled me back awake. A soft creak from the porch, a faint thump outside near the shed, the sound of something brushing against the wall of the cabin. Each noise made me sit up and stare at the door. I didn't hear footsteps or voices or anything clear enough to identify, just random sounds that felt too close for comfort. By morning, my muscles felt stiff from constantly tensing. The cabin looked normal in the daylight, but the quiet outside felt even deeper than before. I stepped onto the porch to breathe fresh air and noticed marks in the dirt near the steps. They were long, shallow grooves spaced inches apart. At first I thought they were from an animal dragging something, but the lines were too straight, too even. They looked almost deliberate. I walked around the cabin slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. More of those grooves stretched toward the treeline in pairs, like something had been pulled across the clearing. Nothing heavy, but something long. I tried to brush it off again. Maybe fallen branches had been dragged by the wind, even though I hadn't seen any on the ground. I kept telling myself not to make a big deal out of small things. I ate a quick breakfast and went for a short walk to clear my head. The forest felt thick and closed in. Every direction looked the same, the trees packed so tightly together that barely any sunlight made it through. Even the air smelled too still, like it had been trapped for a long time. I didn't go far because I didn't want to lose sight of the cabin. Something in my gut felt uneasy about wandering too deep. The second night was worse, much worse. After sunset, the temperature dropped faster than the night before. I kept the wood stove going, feeding it pieces of firewood I found stacked behind the cabin. The orange glow from the stove flickered against the walls, making the shadows shift in slow, uneasy movements. My nerves were already tight from lack of sleep, and I kept glancing toward the windows even though I told myself not to. I couldn't see anything outside except the dark outline of trees. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. Not footsteps, not scratching, not the random sounds from the night before. It was breathing, slow, heavy breathing coming from just outside the wall near the back of the cabin. Deep, steady breaths like someone standing still and taking long, controlled inhales. I froze instantly. My spine felt cold, and my heartbeat hammered against my chest so hard it felt like it echoed inside my head. I sat completely still on the bed, not daring to make a sound. The breathing continued, steady and unhurried. It was unmistakably human, too deep and slow for an animal. My thoughts raced, but my body wouldn't move. The breathing stayed in the same spot for what felt like a full minute. Then it shifted, not by walking away, but like the source slowly turned its head, causing the direction of the breathing to change. I imagined someone standing inches from the wooden wall of the cabin, leaning in, listening. I stayed frozen until the breathing stopped abruptly. The silence afterward felt even worse. I waited for footsteps or movement, but nothing came. No leaves rustled, no branches broke, no sound of retreat, just sudden silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept staring at the stove's fading glow and listening to the darkness. Hours crawled by until faint light began to appear through the windows. When morning finally arrived, I stepped outside with shaky legs and circled the cabin to check the area where I had heard the breathing. The dirt looked disturbed in several small patches, like someone had been stepping lightly. But the footprints weren't clear enough to identify. They were smudged and uneven, almost like someone intentionally dragged their feet to hide their tracks. I followed them for a few steps, but they disappeared into the forest too quickly. My stomach tightened when I saw something new. Marks on the back wall of the cabin, thin scratches spaced almost the exact width of a hand. They weren't animal scratches. They were too straight, too vertical, as if someone had run their fingers along the wall softly, not to damage it, but to feel it. I wanted to pack up and leave, but I had no signal and the drive back would take hours on rough road. I forced myself to stay calm and told myself I might have imagined parts of it from exhaustion. But deep down, I knew I didn't imagine that breathing. The third day felt the longest. I tried keeping myself busy, chopping small pieces of wood, cleaning the space inside, and making sure the door latch was secure. But everything I did felt pointless because the fear stayed in my chest the whole time. The forest around the clearing felt tighter, like the trees had shifted closer overnight. Every sound made me jump even though most of the time it was nothing. I kept noticing small details I hadn't seen before. The shed door slightly more open than yesterday, more of those shallow grooves in the dirt, and a faint smell in the air near the treeline. Something musky and sour, almost like sweat left in the sun too long. The third night broke me. The breathing returned, but this time it wasn't just in one spot. It circled the cabin slowly. I heard the heavy inhales and exhales move from the back wall to the side, then pause near the window, then slide toward the porch. It felt calculated, as if whoever was out there was mapping the interior by sound. Every breath seemed controlled, steady, almost patient. I kept sitting on the bed with my knees pulled to my chest, unable to move. My own breathing became shallow from fear, and I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep myself quiet. At one point, I heard something brush against the window frame. Not tapping, not hitting, just a faint slide like fingertips gliding along the wood. My throat tightened, and tears formed in my eyes from the panic. I waited for the breathing to stop again, but it didn't. It stayed, circling slowly, with long pauses between each part of the cabin. Near dawn, exhaustion finally forced my eyes shut for a few minutes. When I woke up, the breathing was gone. The silence outside felt sickening. I stepped out after sunrise when I felt safe enough. In the dirt near the porch, I found clearer footprints. Bare footprints, long, narrow, and deep enough to show weight. They moved around the cabin in a perfect circle, matching exactly where I heard the breathing. I scanned the treeline but saw nothing but endless trees. No movement, no signs of anyone living out there. The tracks vanished into the forest like before, disappearing almost too cleanly. I knew then I couldn't stay for the fourth night. I didn't care how early it was. I just wanted to get out of there. I packed as fast as I could, barely paying attention to how sloppy I shoved everything back into my bag. I checked inside the cabin twice, making sure I didn't leave anything behind. Before stepping out for the last time, I took one more look around the room. The scratches on the wall, the disturbed dirt outside, the footprints. Everything made sense only in one way. Someone had been watching me. As I walked toward my car, I noticed something that made my blood turn cold. Behind the cabin near the shed, the ground had been cleared of leaves in a narrow shape. A human-sized shape. The dirt was pressed down like someone had been lying there recently. The disturbed area led into the shed. I didn't want to look inside, but something in me forced me to. The shed was empty except for a few tools hanging crookedly on the wall. But on the ground, I saw it. A pile of folded clothes, dirty and worn down, covered in mud. Clothes in sizes too small for me. Clothes that belonged to someone else. Someone who had been living in the forest. Someone who had probably been watching that cabin long before I ever arrived. I backed away quickly, my hands shaking. I climbed into my car and locked the doors even before starting the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. The trees on both sides of the road looked the same, but every now and then I thought I saw movement deep between them. Not running, not hiding, just standing still. It took almost 40 minutes before I got cell signal again. The moment my phone connected, dozens of notifications popped up, but I ignored them all. I kept driving until the forest finally opened into wider land. When I got home, I didn't sleep for nearly a full day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those footprints circling the cabin or felt that heavy breathing through the wall. I kept imagining what would have happened if I had gone outside one of those nights, or if the door latch hadn't held, or if curiosity had made me check the window when I heard the breathing approach it. I reported the cabin listing and sent detailed messages to the site owner, explaining everything I found. They removed the listing within hours. I never heard back from them. I don't know if someone went to check the property or if they already knew something was wrong there. Weeks passed, but the fear didn't leave. I kept waking up at night with the same heavy breathing echoing in my mind. I kept checking the corners of my room, the hallway, the lock on my door. Even now, part of me feels like whoever was out there knew I was leaving that morning. The breathing had stopped right before dawn like it always did. The footprints circled the cabin in a slow, steady pattern, almost like they were waiting for me to fall asleep. But I didn't, and I think that made the difference, because whoever was out there was patient, very patient, and someone who waits like that doesn't stop just because you leave. Someone who waits like that simply moves on to their next spot, their next cabin, their next clearing, their next person who thinks they're alone. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon after a long drive through the mountains. The road had been narrow and full of sharp turns, and the last few miles had been nothing but dirt and rocks. The cabin sat alone in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked most of the sky. The place looked older than I expected. The wooden boards were dark from years of sun and rain, and the front steps sagged a little under my weight when I walked up to the porch. The air smelled like cold soil, pine, and old leaves. I felt tired but also calm, like I had finally reached a place away from everything. I had come here to spend a few quiet days by myself, far from noise and people. The cabin belonged to a friend who rarely used it anymore, and I had always wanted to see what it was like to stay in a place this isolated. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The inside smelled dusty, like a room that had been shut for months. There were simple things inside. A small table, a wood stove, one chair, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, and a small kitchen counter with old tools and pans on it. The room felt colder than the outside, and the air seemed still, like nothing had moved inside for a long time. I unpacked slowly, placing my bag near the bed and checking the windows to see if they closed properly. I noticed scratches on the window frame, thin lines that didn't look like they came from tools. They looked more like marks from something sharp being dragged along the wood. I brushed it off as old damage. The cabin was old. It made sense for it to have strange marks. After settling in, I walked around the clearing to stretch my legs. The trees were dense, and the forest floor was covered with needles, fallen branches, and stones. The cabin sat in a sloped area, with the ground rising behind it into a thick line of trees. I walked a few minutes into the woods but didn't go far because the trees blocked most of the light. The deeper I went, the less I could see the sky. It also became very quiet, the kind of quiet where even small sounds feel loud. My own breathing seemed too sharp. I returned to the cabin, gathered some wood from the pile stacked under the porch, and started a fire inside the stove to warm the place. As the room filled with heat, I felt more relaxed. I ate a simple meal, sat on the bed, and listened to the sound of the fire. Outside, the sun faded behind the trees, and the clearing turned darker. I looked out the window and saw only the first stars between the branches. When it finally became night, the darkness around the cabin felt heavy. There were no streetlights, no nearby houses, nothing. Just the black shapes of trees surrounding the clearing. I crawled into bed and tried to sleep. For a while, everything was quiet, but sometime after midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't loud. It sounded like a step on dry leaves, then another, and then nothing again. I lay still and listened. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. The forest was full of things that moved at night. It made no sense to be worried, but the sound had felt slow and careful, not like the quick movement animals usually make. I stayed awake for a long time, listening to the silence. When I finally fell asleep, the fire had already burned down to faint orange light inside the stove. The next morning, I woke up early. My back felt stiff from the bed, and the air inside the cabin was cold again. I stepped outside to get more firewood. As I walked toward the wood pile, I noticed prints in the dirt behind the cabin. My first thought was that they were from an animal, but the shape looked odd. They weren't sharp like hooves. They weren't rounded like paws. They looked more like the marks of boots, but not as clear. Like someone had walked there at night, but then the wind had softened the prints. The thought of someone walking behind the cabin made my stomach tighten. I looked around the trees, scanning the shadows between the trunks. Everything was still. Nothing looked disturbed. I told myself the prints were from me walking there the day before, even though I knew they weren't. They were too far from the path I had taken, and they were fresh. I spent the morning inside, cleaning the place and checking the small storage area under the counter. The old tools inside were covered in dust. A few were rusty. Everything looked untouched. After eating lunch, I walked into the woods again, this time sticking close to the cabin, but circling the clearing to get a better look at the area. The forest floor was soft and full of deep shadows even though it was daytime. I kept thinking about the prints. When I reached the back of the cabin again, I noticed something I had missed earlier. A piece of broken branch wedged between two roots. The end looked like it had snapped recently. The break was fresh, the wood inside still pale. It didn't feel right. I hadn't walked there, and I didn't remember seeing it the day before. The rest of the day passed slowly. I tried to distract myself by reading and writing in a small notebook I had brought. But every small sound outside made me stop and listen. The forest seemed more active than the night before. I heard things moving between the trees, but each time I looked outside, I saw nothing. By evening, the air became colder, and clouds covered the sky, making the clearing darker earlier than usual. I lit the stove and kept it burning stronger than the night before. I ate dinner while staring at the door, feeling uneasy for no clear reason. The quiet cabin felt different, like it was holding its breath. As night came again, I felt more alert, more aware of every noise. I lay in bed, eyes open, waiting for the darkness to settle completely. The fire in the stove made a low crackling sound. Wind brushed against the walls. Everything felt normal until I heard it again. A step. This time it was clearer. A slow, steady step outside, on the side of the cabin near the wall where the bed was. Then another, and another. The steps moved in a single line, like someone walking slowly along the outer wall. The cabin had no light outside. Whoever or whatever was out there had to move in complete darkness. I stayed perfectly still. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was shaking the mattress. The steps stopped directly outside my window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited, hoping the sound would go away. Minutes passed. Then I heard the sound again, but farther away this time, moving around the corner and disappearing behind the cabin. I stayed awake long after the sound was gone. I waited until the fire burned out completely, leaving the room dark and cold. When morning finally came, I stepped outside carefully. The ground around the cabin was covered in disturbed leaves. It looked like someone had walked around the cabin several times. The marks were faint but noticeable. I crouched near the wall where I had heard the steps stop. The soil there was slightly pressed down. I could see the shape of a heel. I decided to stay alert that day and not go far into the woods. I kept close to the cabin and checked the area often, walking slow and looking for anything unusual. In the afternoon, I heard a sharp cracking sound from deeper in the woods. It reminded me of the sound of weight shifting on a branch. When I looked in that direction, I saw nothing but rows of dark trees. I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was a hunter, maybe someone local passing through. But the steps in the night, the slow pace, the way they stopped right outside the window, it didn't feel random. It felt deliberate. As the third night came, the fear sat heavier in my chest. I locked the door, pushed the small table in front of it, and kept the fire burning bright. The inside of the cabin glowed with orange light, making the shadows shift on the walls. I sat on the bed with my back against the wall, wide awake. Hours passed in silence. My breathing felt loud. Every small pop from the stove made me jump. Then, at some point late in the night, I heard something different. Not footsteps, not the wind. A slow sliding sound on the wooden wall. It started near the far corner of the cabin and moved upward. Then another sound joined it, something brushing lightly against the wood, like a hand dragging along the wall. I froze and stared at the door. The sliding sound moved higher, then stopped. After a long silence, I heard a soft thump near the window. I didn't dare move. The fire was still burning, so whoever was outside could probably see the light from the cracks in the boards. The thought made my skin crawl. After many long minutes, the sounds faded away. I stayed awake until the fire died again. I didn't sleep at all. When daylight returned, I stepped outside and walked to the side of the cabin where I had heard the sliding noise. I expected to see scratches or marks, but there was nothing. The wall looked the same as before. I looked down and saw fresh prints in the dirt. This time they were clearer, shaped like the front of a boot. I followed them slowly, walking a few steps into the woods before they disappeared into the heavy brush. I knew then that someone had been watching the cabin. Not passing by, not wandering, watching. I thought about leaving immediately, but the road was rough, and driving down it in fear could be dangerous. I decided to wait until morning, when I was fully awake and alert. I planned to pack my things before sunrise and leave at first light. I spent the rest of the day preparing, checking the car, and making sure everything was ready. When night arrived again, I felt more tense than ever. I kept the fire burning strong, sat close to the stove, and listened to every sound. Hours passed. The forest outside felt alive with quiet movement. I could feel it even when I didn't hear anything. Sometime after midnight, the sounds began again. Soft steps, slow and measured, came from behind the cabin. They moved around the side, each one landing with the same careful pressure on the leaves. When they reached the window area, they stopped. I sat still, holding my breath, waiting for the next sound. I heard the faintest creak from the wooden frame of the window. Something was outside pressing against it. The pressure made the old wood shift slightly. Then the pressure stopped. The footsteps moved again, circling the cabin slowly, like the person outside was checking every wall, every corner, every possible entry. I felt trapped, couldn't run, couldn't shout. The cabin felt defenseless, like thin wood separating me from whatever was inches away. The footsteps circled the cabin twice. On the third round, they stopped near the door. I heard a soft thump against it, then another, like someone lightly tapping it, testing how solid it was. The table I had pushed against the door felt too small, too weak. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for the next sound. But after a few minutes, everything went silent. The silence lasted until morning. When the sun finally came up, I checked outside again. The prints around the cabin were deeper, more numerous. Whoever had been walking around had spent a long time circling the place. I didn't check the woods. I didn't want to know if the prints led somewhere. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin behind me even though it felt pointless, and walked to my car. The whole time, the forest felt like it was watching. I started the engine and drove down the dirt road as calmly as I could, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. When I reached the main road, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The farther I got from the cabin, the lighter the air felt. It wasn't until I reached the town many miles away that I stopped the car and rested in a parking lot. My hands were shaking so hard I had to wait for them to calm down before I could drive again. In the days that followed, I kept replaying everything in my head. The steps, the marks, the pressure on the window, the slow circling of the cabin. Whoever it was had never tried to break in, but they didn't need to. They wanted me to know they were there. They wanted me to feel watched, cornered, helpless. They had all the patience in the world. I told no one the full details. I only said I didn't like the cabin, that it made me uncomfortable. I never went back for the rest of my belongings I left behind. The idea of returning to that clearing, of walking up those sagging steps again, made my stomach twist. The cabin still sits there, alone in the woods, surrounded by tall trees that hide the sky. I think about it sometimes, especially at night when I can't sleep. I imagine the quiet clearing, the cold air, and the soft steps moving slowly around the walls. And I know that whoever was out there that night is probably still in those woods, waiting for someone else to stay there long enough to be watched the same way I was. I have no plans to ever be that person again. I drove toward the small cabin long before the sun came up because I wanted to reach it before the heat grew worse. The road leading there was narrow and full of old roots pushing through the ground. The whole place sat near a quiet lake, with tall pine trees rising so close together that the sky looked like a thin blue line between them. I rented the cabin for a week because I wanted silence, open space, and a break from people. I expected peace, maybe a slow week where I cooked simple food and walked by the water. I had no idea the place would make me feel watched from the first hour. The cabin looked older than the listing had shown. The wood was darker, the roof sagged slightly, and the porch leaned forward as if the whole thing was tired. When I stepped out of my car, I heard nothing but wind sliding through dry branches. Even the birds were quiet. The lake sat behind the cabin, still enough to reflect everything like a sheet of dark glass. I remember thinking that the silence felt too strong, almost heavy, like the place had not seen people in a long time. I opened the door and smelled dust and old wood that soaked into the air. The cabin had one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a bathroom with a thin metal pipe that made a rattling sound when the water ran. There were scratches on the floor, but I assumed they came from heavy furniture being dragged at some point. I unpacked slowly, moving each item into place so I would feel more settled. The quiet made every sound I made echo just a little, giving me a strange feeling like someone else was doing the same movements beside me, only out of sight. The first few hours were calm. I sat on the porch, listening to the soft creaking of the wooden boards beneath me. The sun reached the top of the trees, warming the air but not enough to make me sweat. I walked to the edge of the lake and looked down at my reflection, watching the water slowly break my face apart as tiny ripples touched it. Everything felt calm, but there was still a feeling in my chest telling me I should stay alert. It was small but steady, a quiet tension that did not match the peaceful view around me. When I returned to the cabin, I saw something that made my stomach feel hollow for a moment. A piece of paper sat on the porch, folded in half. I knew it had not been there earlier. I had cleaned the entire porch when I arrived, brushing away dust and dead pine needles. The paper was clean, white, and out of place. I bent down, picked it up, and unfolded it. Inside was one short line written in dark pencil. The handwriting looked slow and almost shaky. It said, "I saw you arrive." There was no name, no explanation. The message was so simple that it felt more threatening than if it had been detailed. I looked around slowly, scanning the tree line, the narrow path to the road, the edge of the lake. Nothing moved. No sound came from anywhere. My mind tried to find a calm explanation. Maybe a leftover joke from the last person who stayed here. Maybe something left by accident. But the words looked too fresh, too recently written. And someone had placed it on the porch while I walked to the lake. I checked the door to make sure I had locked it earlier. I had. That made me feel a bit better, but I still kept scanning the woods every few seconds. The silence felt stronger now, like everything around me was waiting for my reaction. I tried to shake the tension away and went inside. I placed the note on the kitchen counter and tried to distract myself by boiling water for coffee. As the water heated, the cabin made small popping sounds as the wood adjusted to the warming temperature. But then there was another sound, a softer one, almost like a foot brushing over dry leaves, came from outside the window. I stepped slowly toward the closest window and looked out. Only trees, shadows, and stillness. No movement, but I could not ignore the feeling that someone was standing just out of sight, holding their breath. The coffee helped calm my hands a little, but the edge in my mind stayed sharp. I tried to act normal and sat on the couch with my drink, staring at the fireplace. The cabin felt tighter than before, like the walls had moved closer to me. I finished my cup and decided to walk around the cabin from the outside to see if anyone was hiding nearby. The ground around the cabin was covered with thick pine needles, making it hard to see footprints. But as I walked behind the cabin, near the bathroom window, I noticed something that froze me in place. Another piece of paper sat on the ground, weighed down by a small stone. It was folded just like the first one. I stared at it for several seconds before crouching to pick it up. This note said, "You didn't see me." My heartbeat grew loud in my ears. The words felt like someone whispering directly into my thoughts. Someone had been close enough to place the note behind the cabin, where I had walked earlier when unloading my bags. I stood still for a long time, trying to hear any sign of movement in the woods. But I heard nothing. No steps, no rustling, no breathing. The world held itself completely still. I moved away from the woods and returned inside, locking the door again even though I had just unlocked it minutes before. The lock felt weak in my hand, small and cheap. I pressed my palm against it after turning it, as if that might make it stronger. I spent the next hour inside, not sitting, not relaxing, just walking from window to window and checking the tree line. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, but I was never sure. A branch might sway a little or a shadow might stretch in a new direction, but nothing clear enough to point at and say it was a person. At one point I thought I saw something pale behind one of the trees, maybe a face or a piece of clothing, but when I blinked, it vanished. Late in the afternoon, I decided I needed to gather firewood. The air turned cooler and the sky dimmed with thick clouds. The cabin was far enough from town that losing sunlight too early could make the night feel longer and heavier. I walked around the cabin again, this time keeping my eyes sharp, scanning every space between the trees. I collected old broken branches, stacking them into my arms. As I bent down to pick up a thick piece of wood, I saw something on the ground behind another tree. Another folded piece of paper leaned against the trunk. My throat tightened as I approached it slowly. This one said, "I am closer now." My skin felt cold even though I had been gathering wood and moving around. I backed away from the tree, not turning my back fully to the woods, and went straight inside. I placed the firewood near the fireplace and sat on the floor for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to make sense of the situation. I tried to think logically. Maybe someone lived around here and watched the cabin often. Maybe they thought it was funny to scare visitors. But the notes felt too personal, too timed to my movements. Whoever left them had been watching me since I arrived, staying close enough to track where I walked. I lit a small fire to warm the cabin as the air grew darker. The flames cast long orange shadows on the walls, making the inside feel alive in a slow, unsettling way. I sat on the couch and watched the fire for a long time. As evening turned into night, the woods outside became a solid black mass. Even the lake disappeared into the darkness. I could not see anything outside the windows anymore. The cabin began to feel like a box made of thin wood. The walls felt too thin, the windows too large, the lock too weak. I kept all the lights on even though it made me feel exposed. I didn't want to sit in darkness with the idea that someone was standing just inches away, watching me, unseen. Around midnight, I heard something on the porch. It was soft but not natural. Not an animal, not the wind. It sounded like a slow, controlled step. Then another. The boards of the porch creaked slightly under the weight. I felt frozen, my body stiff, my breath paused halfway in my throat. I stood up slowly and moved toward the window that looked out to the porch. I kept the lights on behind me, which made the glass reflect my own face, making it harder to see outside. But I pressed my forehead close to the cool glass, trying to see anything in the darkness. No movement, no figure. Then I noticed something new on the wooden boards of the porch. A small white shape, another piece of paper. My stomach felt tight, and my hands shook slightly. Whoever left it had been standing only a few feet away from where I slept. I didn't open the door to grab it. I stayed inside until the sky began to lighten with early morning colors. Only when the woods turned gray instead of black did I step outside. I kept looking around, expecting someone to jump from behind a tree, but again, nothing moved. The woods were still. I picked up the paper. This one said, the letters looked rougher this time, darker, almost pressed harder into the paper. I stood on the porch for a long moment, scanning the woods with careful eyes. I kept expecting to see someone leaning behind a tree, watching me openly now. But the woods stood quiet and hollow, offering no clues at all. I considered leaving that morning, but something in my mind wanted to understand what was happening. I wanted to know who was doing this and why. Leaving felt like running away without answers, and the need to know felt stronger than the fear. So I told myself I would stay one more day, but if anything else happened, I would pack up and go immediately. The day stayed quiet, too quiet. Every few minutes I caught myself staring out the window, expecting movement. I walked outside often, checking behind trees, scanning the edge of the lake, looking for fresh footprints. But the ground remained too covered with pine needles for clear marks. By late evening, I started to feel slightly calmer. Nothing had happened since morning. The calm made me think maybe whoever was doing this had moved on or lost interest. I tried to settle into a routine, cooking simple food and organizing a few things inside the cabin. The quiet still felt heavy, but I tried to ignore it. When night fell, I locked the door again, double-checking it. I planned to stay awake for a while, just to keep myself aware of any noises. I sat near the fireplace, letting the warm light fill the room. Outside, the woods turned black again, hiding everything. Around midnight, I decided to check the windows again. I walked slowly from one side of the cabin to the other, each window showing nothing but darkness. But when I reached the small window near the bathroom, I saw something that made the air leave my lungs in one slow, sick feeling. A face, not clearly, not fully, but a pale shape just outside the window, unmoving. The shape disappeared the moment I blinked, and I couldn't tell if it had actually been there or if my tired brain created it out of shadows and fear. But the feeling it left behind was sharp and real. I stepped away from the window, heart racing, palms sweating. I stayed awake the entire night. The next morning, I found another note. This one was inside the cabin. I found it on the floor near the fireplace, folded neatly, waiting for me as if placed with care. I knew for a fact the door had been locked all night. I checked it multiple times. That meant someone had entered while I was watching the windows or when I had stepped away for moments. My hands shook as I picked it up. It said, the words felt like a punch. I read them again and again, hoping I misunderstood them, but the message was clear. Someone had been inside the cabin. Someone had been close enough to me while I slept that they could leave this note on the floor. Every part of me wanted to run, but I felt trapped. I didn't know if the person was still inside, hiding in a corner, behind furniture, or under the cabin. I checked every room, even though fear filled my chest like ice. The cabin was small, but shadows felt deeper now. I checked the closet, the bathroom, under the bed. Nothing, but the absence of a person didn't calm me. It only made the situation worse. Whoever had entered could come and go without being seen. I packed immediately. I shoved everything into my bags without folding or organizing. I moved fast, aware that every second inside the cabin felt dangerous. I grabbed the notes too, stuffing them into a pocket because I didn't want to leave them behind for any reason. I didn't look out the windows while packing. I didn't want to see another pale shape or the outline of someone standing still. I opened the door and carried my bags to the car. The woods were quiet again, watching me. The air felt colder than it should for that time of day. I loaded everything and got into the driver's seat, locking the doors quickly. My hands shook as I started the engine. But before I drove away, I looked toward the cabin one last time. Something on the porch caught my eye. A final note. It was stuck under a small stone, placed neatly in the center of the porch, as if someone wanted to make sure I saw it before leaving. I stared at it from inside the car, debating whether to ignore it, but curiosity pushed hard. I stepped out slowly, keeping the car door open behind me, ready to jump back in if I heard anything. I picked up the note and unfolded it. It said, "I was under the cabin all night. I heard you moving. I heard you breathe. I watched you leave. Asterisk, asterisk. My body felt cold all over. I backed away from the porch slowly. I didn't look toward the narrow space under the cabin. I didn't want to see anything moving or hear anything crawling out. I walked backward to the car, keeping my eyes on the treeline, then got inside, locked the doors, and drove onto the road as fast as I could without sliding on the dirt. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main highway. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone running behind my car or stepping out of the woods. When I got home hours later, I took the notes from my pocket and read them again. The words made me feel sick each time. I threw them into a drawer and shut it tight, as if that would trap the memories inside too. The next day, I called the rental company and told them the cabin needed to be checked. I didn't tell them everything, but I told them enough to make them send someone out there. They called me back later. They said they didn't find anyone. They didn't find footprints, signs of break-ins, or anything unusual. They said everything looked normal. But there was one detail they added that made my skin crawl. They said the small space under the cabin was extremely narrow, barely big enough for a person to squeeze into. It was full of old dirt, dry leaves, and spider webs. Whoever was under there had to lie completely flat, pressed into the ground, barely able to move. They told me no one could stay down there long, but I knew they were wrong. Someone had stayed under there long enough to watch me sleep, to listen to my breaths through the floorboards, and to crawl out again the next morning without leaving a single sound. And the worst part, the part that stayed with me long after the fear faded, was the realization that I had been standing above them, walking, sitting, breathing, while they waited in the dark just inches below my feet. That cabin still shows up in my thoughts whenever I lie down at night. Sometimes I imagine the floor beneath me turning hollow, someone pressing their face against the underside of it, listening to the rhythm of my breathing. Sometimes I wake up and feel like eyes are underneath me, not behind a window or near a tree, but right under the floor, hidden in darkness. I haven't gone back to any cabin since then. I don't think I ever will. And even now, sometimes when I wake before sunrise, I swear I hear the faintest sound of movement beneath the floorboards, like someone shifting their weight slowly, waiting for me to get close enough to hear them whisper something I never want to read on paper again. I had always been drawn to the mountains in late autumn. There was something about the quiet isolation, the sharp chill in the air, and the way the sun fell early behind the peaks that made me feel alive, alert, and strangely at peace. This time, I had chosen a cabin deep in the northern woods, a place I had read about in a small, forgotten blog. The cabin wasn't advertised in any major travel guides. It was simply listed as a private rental, tucked away far from any major roads. The reviews were sparse, but everyone who wrote said the same thing. It was remote, rustic, and perfect for anyone looking to disappear for a few days. That was exactly what I wanted. I was tired of the city, tired of people, tired of the constant noise. I wanted nothing but silence, trees, and the cold. I arrived late afternoon on a Friday, after hours of driving over narrow, winding roads. The last 10 miles had been dirt and gravel, full of potholes and loose rocks. At one point, I swerved to avoid a fallen branch and realized how easy it would be to lose control here. My car rattled over the uneven ground, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows in the forest thickened, folding in on themselves until the trees became a wall of darkness. Felt like driving into another world. When I finally saw the cabin, I was relieved. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs with a steep roof, dark windows, and a stone chimney that promised warmth inside. The path to it was narrow, barely wide enough for my car, and lined with overgrown bushes and old pines. I parked in front and got out, stretching, listening to the wind rustling through the dead leaves. It was the kind of quiet that was so complete it almost hurt your ears. No birds, no insects, no other signs of life. Only the wind and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere deeper in the forest. The cabin was simple. A single room with a loft above, a stone fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a sturdy wooden table. There was a small stack of firewood beside the fireplace and a metal stove in the corner. The windows were covered in condensation from the cool air, but it didn't matter. I wanted the view of the trees anyway. I unpacked my bag, lit the fire, and watched the flames dance. The warmth was immediate, comforting, and I felt my tension begin to ease. I had brought food, water, and a few basic supplies. There was no electricity beyond a single generator, and I planned to spend my weekend without screens, without work, without people. Night fell quickly. The darkness outside was absolute, swallowing the cabin and the surrounding trees. I ate a small dinner and settled into a chair by the fire with a book, letting the quiet press in around me. Every now and then, I would hear a distant snap or rustle, something moving in the forest, but I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. Still, the sounds seemed too deliberate, too close. I shook my head, trying to ignore it, telling myself I was letting my imagination run wild. As the night deepened, the wind picked up. It moaned through the trees like a living thing, brushing against the cabin and rattling the windows. I checked the locks, made sure the doors were secure, and tried to go back to reading. But sleep didn't come easily. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow in the corners of the room sharper. I couldn't help but imagine someone walking outside, just beyond the reach of my lantern. I knew it was unlikely. This place was so remote, but the fear was primal, lodged deep in my chest where logic couldn't touch it. Around midnight, I finally drifted off in the chair by the fire, curled under a blanket. I woke hours later to a noise that froze me instantly. It was soft at first, a faint scrape against the cabin wall. Then another, and another, slow, deliberate, like someone testing the boundaries. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't want to move, didn't want to look, but I had no choice. I grabbed a flashlight from the table and aimed it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness outside, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. I took a step closer to the door, trying to make sense of the sound. That's when I noticed it. A thin, broken branch, lying unnaturally close to the cabin's wall, bent in a way it shouldn't be. My pulse jumped. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something had moved around the cabin. I tried to reason through it. Maybe it was an animal. A bear, perhaps. I remembered seeing claw marks on a tree during my hike earlier that day. But bears usually didn't approach human structures so carefully. And the sound had been deliberate, slow, and measured, not the chaotic thumps of a large animal. I spent the next hour pacing the cabin, flashlight in hand, checking every corner, every window. Every so often, I thought I heard breathing outside. The wind had changed direction, blowing cold air through the cracks in the cabin, carrying scents I couldn't identify. I sat back down near the fire, trying to calm myself, telling myself I was alone, telling myself it was a prank, a joke of nature, anything. But I didn't sleep again that night. Morning came reluctantly. The sky was overcast, thick clouds dulling the sunlight. I went outside cautiously, circling the cabin. There were footprints in the soft mud around the perimeter, human footprints. They were large, booted, and uneven, as if the person had been moving slowly, deliberately. My stomach twisted. Whoever had been outside last night had walked around the cabin, checking it, maybe waiting for me to sleep. I realized I had to leave, but the dirt road back to the main highway was treacherous, muddy, and narrow. I couldn't just run. I needed a plan. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I remembered the generator. Maybe I could use the battery for some temporary light if it got dark again. I gathered some supplies, made sure my fire was completely out, and prepared to move cautiously. I decided to hike down the road on foot, leaving the car hidden behind some thick bushes. Every step was tense. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the trees made me freeze. I kept my eyes on the path, my ears tuned to the faintest movement. Hours passed. The path curved and twisted, steep in parts, the mud sucking at my boots. My legs were sore, my hands scraped from pushing branches aside. But eventually, the road widened, the trees thinned, and I spotted the first sign of civilization: an abandoned ranger station. The station was empty, but I found a working radio inside. I called the local authorities, explaining the situation carefully, not exaggerating but making sure they understood. Within the hour, a patrol car arrived, 2 officers stepping cautiously into the station with flashlights and weapons drawn. I led them back to the cabin, explaining every detail as we went. When we arrived, the cabin was empty, except for signs that someone had been there recently. Discarded food wrappers, footprints in the mud, and a few scuffed marks on the door. The officers searched the surrounding area for hours, but found no one. They confirmed it wasn't wildlife. The prints were definitely human, too deliberate, and there were other subtle signs that someone had watched the cabin for days, waiting. I left the cabin that day, leaving everything behind. My car was too far to reach safely, so I had to hike several more miles before finally flagging down another patrol. They drove me back to the nearest town, where I stayed in a small motel, the kind with lights on all night and a constant hum of life. I couldn't sleep for 2 nights straight, constantly imagining the person who had been outside the cabin, just watching, just waiting. Weeks later, I learned that there had been a series of break-ins in remote cabins in that region. The suspect had never been caught. The pattern was the same. The intruder would observe the cabin first, then approach carefully at night, leaving no immediate evidence but creating an overwhelming sense of dread for anyone inside. I realized how close I had come to real danger. Someone could have broken in while I slept, and there would have been no one to help. Even now, months later, I can't forget the quiet of that night, the slow scrape against the wall, the deliberate steps around the cabin in the darkness. But I also learned something else. I learned how to prepare for isolation, how to anticipate danger, how to keep calm when every instinct tells you to panic. I bought better locks, carried a reliable flashlight and a small hunting knife, and researched survival techniques in remote areas. I decided never to stay somewhere so isolated alone again without proper precautions. There is a strange comfort in knowing the truth, that the world can be quiet, that danger can exist in the most ordinary places, and that sometimes the scariest things are not imagined, but real. I still love the mountains, the forests, and the quiet, but I am always alert now, always careful, always aware. And I have learned to respect the silence, not as peace, but as the potential for something waiting, unseen, outside the walls. The experience changed me. I came away stronger, more prepared, and more aware of my surroundings. The fear I felt in that cabin taught me caution, resilience, and the importance of never taking safety for granted. Even though it was terrifying, even though I had no control, I survived. I made it out, and knowing that I survived, that I faced real fear and came through it, gives me a quiet confidence I never had before. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. But I keep a map of the area, and sometimes I drive past the roads leading there, careful to stay on the main highways, careful to keep my distance. It's a reminder that the world is larger, stranger, and more dangerous than I ever imagined, and that sometimes the most realistic horror is the one you can't run from. Not because it is supernatural, but because it is human. And the human capacity for quiet observation, patience, and deliberate action can be far scarier than any ghost or fairy tale ever imagined. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The city had been a relentless grind, a constant pressure I could never quite escape, and the idea of being alone in the woods, away from everything, had seemed like the perfect remedy. The cabin I rented was miles away from the nearest town, hidden deep in the forest, surrounded by towering pines and the thick smell of earth after rain. The path leading up to it was rough and uneven, but the solitude was exactly what I wanted. I had imagined quiet evenings sitting by the window, watching the sun dip below the treetops, the sound of the wind in the branches my only companion. I never imagined that solitude could feel suffocating. The drive to the cabin had been long and tiring. The road twisted through dense forest, narrow and lined with trees so close together that I felt like I was driving through a tunnel. At some points, the asphalt was cracked, overgrown with grass and weeds, and I had to slow down to a crawl to avoid scraping the underside of my car. By the time I arrived, the sky was pale orange, the last light of the sun stretching thinly across the horizon. I parked in front of the cabin and sat for a moment, taking in the isolation. The cabin was small, rustic, but sturdy. Its wooden frame had weathered over time, and the roof had a few patches that looked like they had been replaced recently. A chimney jutted out crookedly from one end, and a small pile of firewood leaned against the side. The air smelled clean, a mix of pine and damp earth. It was beautiful, untouched, and completely alone. I unloaded my bag and stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood polish and old smoke. Dust motes floated in the shafts of late afternoon light that filtered through the thin curtains. The space was simple. A small kitchen area, a living space with a worn couch and a wooden table, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft bedroom. I set down my bag and took a moment to stretch, feeling the tension of the city fall away from my shoulders. The quiet was heavy, but not uncomfortable at first. It was soothing, almost therapeutic, in the way only true silence can be. I lit a fire in the fireplace, stacking the logs carefully and coaxing them to life with dry kindling. The crackling of the fire was comforting. Outside, the forest was already darkening, shadows stretching across the clearing. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, sitting at the table and listening to the night settle around the cabin. Crickets chirped steadily, and every so often, I could hear the distant rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. I had expected some wildlife, but the sounds felt amplified in the isolation, and I found myself watching the windows more than I had planned. As night fell completely, I climbed the narrow stairs to the loft and crawled into bed. The mattress was thin and the blanket scratchy, but it was enough. I lay there for a long time, listening to the wind through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch. My mind wandered. The cabin felt safe, but the deep silence made me unusually alert. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow sharper. I tried to sleep, telling myself I was just being anxious, but the tension lingered. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a faint sound. At first, I thought it was the wind or a tree branch scraping against the roof, but then I realized it was rhythmic, deliberate. A soft tapping, almost like someone walking on the deck outside. My heart jumped. I lay still, straining to hear. The sound stopped, then resumed in irregular bursts. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon, or something similar, but the pacing didn't feel right. I felt my pulse quicken. I got out of bed carefully and crept to the window. The deck was empty. Shadows moved in the trees, but I saw nothing resembling a person. The wind had picked up slightly, and the branches rattled against each other. I exhaled slowly, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks in the dark. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I double-checked the locks on the doors, securing them tightly, and returned to the loft. Sleep came only in fitful waves, my mind racing with possibilities I didn't want to confront. The next morning, I resolved to distract myself. I made coffee on the small stove and ate oatmeal while gazing out at the forest. The sunlight made the cabin seem more welcoming, the isolation less threatening. I spent the day exploring the area, walking carefully through the trees, noting the uneven terrain and occasional clusters of rocks. I kept a sharp eye out for wildlife, and I carried a small hatchet I had brought along, just in case. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth grounding me in the moment. I felt slightly better, though a persistent unease lingered beneath the surface. That night, the tapping returned. Louder this time, more deliberate. It sounded like someone pacing slowly on the deck, stopping occasionally. I froze, straining to make out shapes in the darkness. I considered calling the local sheriff, but my phone had only a weak signal, barely enough to text. I thought about driving out, but the road was long, dark, and treacherous at night. The fire in the fireplace offered some comfort, and I kept it burning, watching the flames dance and listening to the occasional crackle. Still, the tapping persisted, a slow, irregular rhythm that made my stomach tighten. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the front door, hand on the hatchet handle. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly opened the door, shining the beam across the deck. Nothing, just the night, trees, and shadows. I took a step outside, the wooden boards creaking beneath me. The tapping stopped abruptly. I froze, listening. The forest was quiet except for the wind. I scanned the darkness carefully, flashlight in hand, my breath forming small clouds in the cold night air. Nothing moved. I finally closed the door, leaning against it for a long moment. My pulse slowed slightly, but the tension didn't leave. I kept the flashlight and hatchet by the door and stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to the forest, watching for movement. Over the next few days, the tapping continued sporadically. Sometimes it came late at night, sometimes just before dawn. I grew accustomed to checking the perimeter carefully each evening, shining my flashlight around, looking for signs of someone approaching. Each time, I found nothing, only shadows and the faint outline of trees. I kept the fireplace lit when I could, the fire offering both warmth and comfort. The cabin, once a sanctuary, had started to feel like a trap, and I realized that being alone in the forest was much harder than I had imagined. One afternoon, after a morning of hiking along a nearby stream, I returned to the cabin to find evidence that someone had been inside. It was subtle. The small stack of firewood was slightly moved. A piece of paper on the table was turned over. Nothing was missing, nothing obviously disturbed, but the implication was clear. Someone had been in my cabin while I was gone. My heart sank. I examined the windows and doors, finding no sign of forced entry, and my mind raced. How could someone have gotten in? Was it a neighbor? A hiker? I had no idea, and the uncertainty was unbearable. I strengthened the locks, wedged the doors with furniture, and kept my hatchet close at hand. That night, the tapping began again. This time, it was accompanied by another sound. A scraping noise, like nails dragged across wood. It came from the side of the cabin, near the window where I had set up the small desk. I stayed in the loft, clutching the hatchet, listening as the noises moved from one side of the cabin to the other. I was terrified, but I refused to leave the cabin, knowing that the woods around me were equally dangerous. I could only hope the intruder would leave. Hours passed. The sounds stopped around 3 a.m., leaving a heavy, oppressive silence that made it impossible to sleep. The following morning, I decided I had to confront the situation logically. I gathered supplies, food, water, a backpack, and the hatchet, and carefully inspected the perimeter of the cabin. I found footprints in the soft earth around the back, small and hurried. They led away from the cabin and into the dense forest. I followed them cautiously, keeping my distance, but eventually the tracks disappeared. Whoever had been there was gone, for now. I returned to the cabin, relieved but tense. I realized that staying completely alone in this environment was no longer safe. I spent the next day preparing to leave. I cleaned and packed, making sure the cabin was in good order for the next renter. I double-checked the locks, secured the windows, and stacked the firewood neatly. By late afternoon, I was ready to go. I loaded my bag into the car and took one last look at the cabin. It seemed peaceful in the daylight, almost innocent, but I knew the darkness had a way of changing perception. I started the engine and drove slowly down the narrow road, keeping an eye on the tree line for any movement. The forest receded behind me, and the tension in my shoulders gradually eased. By the time I reached the nearest town, night had fully fallen. The lights of the streets were harsh and overwhelming after the dim forest. I parked near a small diner and sat for a long time, sipping a coffee and trying to calm my nerves. The experience had been terrifying, and I realized that isolation could be far more dangerous than any imagined threat. The cabin had offered solitude and beauty, but it had also exposed me to the unpredictability of human behavior in an environment where help was far away. A few days later, I returned to the city. The memory of the cabin lingered, but with it came a sense of relief and accomplishment. I had faced fear, had been aware of my surroundings at all times, and had prepared myself for danger. The tapping, the footsteps, and the silent intruder had tested my nerves, but I had survived. The experience changed me, making me more cautious, more aware, but also more appreciative of safety and normalcy. I kept the memory not as a story of horror, but as a lesson in vigilance and preparedness. The forest remained beautiful in my mind, but I knew I would never again take solitude in such isolation lightly. I had returned to the city, alive and unscathed, with a clear understanding of the risks that come when isolation meets the unpredictability of human presence. The cabin, eventually, remained behind me, a silent witness to the nights I spent awake, tense, and alert, and the mornings of careful inspection. I had faced the fear of the unknown, and in the end, I had managed to leave safely. It was a good ending, not because the events were easy, but because I survived fully aware and cautious, having learned more about both the forest and myself than I ever expected. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea was simple: escape the city for a week, spend time alone in the woods, and let the silence settle around me. I found a small cabin for rent deep in the mountains, far from the nearest town, far from people. The photos online made it look perfect: log walls, a small wood stove, a porch with a view of the trees, and a creek running nearby. I had never been much of a camper, and the thought of sleeping on the ground or putting up a tent made me uneasy. I needed something more solid, something that would feel safe. The cabin seemed perfect. I left early on a Friday morning, taking the long, winding road into the mountains. The drive itself was peaceful at first. The further I went, the narrower the road became, twisting over ridges and through dense forests. I passed only a handful of cars, each one a brief flicker of life before the woods swallowed it up again. The air changed as I drove, cooler and sharper, smelling of pine and earth. I felt a tension in my shoulders loosen slightly. I told myself I was escaping, finally, and this week was mine alone. By mid-afternoon, I reached the cabin. It sat slightly off the main road, tucked behind a small hill and a grove of tall, straight pine trees. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not the quiet of a city park or a suburban backyard, but the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and seems to listen to your every movement. I parked in the small clearing, got out, and just stood there for a moment. The wind moved through the trees, rustling the needles like a distant whisper. The cabin was solid and small, with one main room and a loft above. The porch sagged slightly, but it added to the rustic charm rather than taking away from it. Inside, it smelled of old wood and something faintly metallic. Dust had settled on the surfaces, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. There was a wood stove, a small kitchen area, a table and chairs, and a few shelves lined with books and old magazines. The loft had a simple mattress, blankets, and a small window looking out over the forest. I unpacked slowly, placing my things on the shelves, arranging the few groceries I had brought. It felt good to move through the cabin, to make it mine for the week, even if I knew no one else would ever see it. The first night was uneventful, but that is when I began to notice small things. A branch tapping against the window, the way the wind seemed to push through the cracks in the walls, the way the creak sounded louder than I remembered, almost like it had grown overnight. I reminded myself constantly that I was alone. No one else was here. The sounds had logical explanations, but still, I could not shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I decided to explore the area. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, and I could see a trail leading into the woods. I put on my boots, grabbed a small backpack with water and snacks, and started walking. The trail was rough, overgrown in places with roots and rocks jutting up from the ground. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Birds sang occasionally, and I could hear squirrels moving in the trees, but beyond that, nothing. No other hikers, no distant roads, no signs of life. I found an old hunting path that led me closer to the creek, which was larger than I had imagined. The water was clear, rushing over rocks and forming small pools. I spent an hour just sitting on a rock, watching the water and listening to the forest. It felt peaceful, but also strangely tense. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves made me flinch slightly. I returned to the cabin before dark. The air had grown colder, and the shadows lengthened across the forest floor. I built a fire in the stove, filling the cabin with light and warmth, and I tried to calm myself. Still, I could not help but feel watched. It was not fear in the traditional sense. No one had threatened me, but a persistent unease that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I convinced myself it was just the isolation, the fact that I was alone in the middle of the woods. The following morning, I woke to a strange noise outside. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but there was a rhythm to it, like footsteps crunching through dead leaves. I froze, listening. It stopped. I looked out the window, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, and tried to go back to sleep. But sleep did not come easily after that. By the third day, the isolation was starting to weigh on me more heavily. I had gone for another walk in the morning, farther this time, following a ridge that gave me a view of the valley below. The sun was high, the forest beautiful in the light, but there was a constant edge, a tension that I could not shake. On my way back, I noticed something I had not seen before. A set of footprints in the mud near the creek. They were large, heavy, human. My stomach sank. I knew no one else should be here, and yet the prints were fresh. I traced them carefully with my eyes. They led into the woods, circling the cabin, then disappearing. My heart pounded. I told myself it was possible a hunter or hiker had come by, but the nearest town was miles away, and I had seen no cars or trails. That night, I did not sleep well. I kept hearing noises outside, subtle at first, but growing more frequent. The wind, the trees, the creek, all of it seemed louder, sharper. Around midnight, I heard the sound clearly. Footsteps around the cabin, deliberate and heavy, circling. My stomach dropped, my body stiffened, and I stayed as quiet as possible. The sound stopped, but I knew it would return. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed my things quickly, not taking time to enjoy the cabin or the forest. As I stepped outside, I saw it. Fresh footprints leading straight up to the cabin and around it. They were large, far larger than mine, heavy, and deep in the soft earth. They circled the cabin several times before heading back into the trees. I felt my hands shake. I got into my car and drove slowly down the narrow road, glancing at the trees on either side. The woods seemed alive, tense, as if they were watching me leave. But I was not out of danger yet. On the way down, I saw movement in the trees ahead. A figure partially obscured by the underbrush, standing completely still. My breath caught in my throat. I slowed the car, trying to see clearly. The figure was tall, broad, and not moving. I pressed the accelerator and drove past it as quickly as I could. When I looked in the rearview mirror, it was gone. I did not stop. I reached the nearest town an hour later, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. I called the local ranger station to report the footprints and the figure. They told me they would send someone to check the area, though they sounded skeptical. I left the woods behind and did not return. Weeks later, I read in the local newspaper that hikers had found a series of abandoned campsites deep in the forest near the cabin I had stayed at. They were evidence of someone living off the grid, moving quietly through the woods, never staying in one place for long. Some of the sites had been there for months, others for years. No one knew who the person was, and no one had ever been able to track them. The footprints I saw, the figure in the trees, they were probably just this person. But the thought that someone had been watching the cabin, that I was not alone for even a single night, stayed with me. I eventually returned to the city, resuming my normal life, but the memory of that cabin haunted me. I could not shake the way the forest had felt alive, the constant tension of being watched, the sound of footsteps in the night. I started to read more about people living off the grid, learning how they could move silently, how they could survive in the woods without being seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tall figure standing among the trees, waiting, always watching. Changed the way I thought about solitude. I used to crave being alone, but now I understood the danger of complete isolation. Being alone in the woods is not peaceful. It is vulnerable. It is a state where a single person, unseen and unknown, can observe you, track you, and you would never even know. I learned to respect that. I learned to carry means of protection, to stay aware, and never to assume safety in silence. The cabin was sold a few months later, I read, to someone who wanted the same experience I had once sought. I hoped they would notice the subtle signs, the way the woods were not quite empty. I never went back, and I never will. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream about that cabin, the creek, the wind, and the footsteps. But I also dream about the choices I made, the decision to leave when I did, the decision to respect the forest and its unseen inhabitants. And in those dreams, I am alive, aware, and cautious. The woods taught me something harsh, something necessary. Survival is not about escaping danger. It is about understanding it, acknowledging it, and never underestimating it. That lesson stayed with me, clear and unshakable. A constant reminder of 1 week alone in a cabin that seemed safe, but was anything but. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The city had become suffocating in ways I couldn't even explain. Crowded streets, endless traffic, the constant hum of people rushing somewhere, anywhere. It all wore on me. I needed silence, isolation, a place far enough away that even the sky felt different. That's why I chose this cabin. It was far off the main road, tucked into a forest I could barely find on a map. The listings online described it as rustic but comfortable, with all the essentials, and no neighbors for miles. That last part had sold me entirely. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The road to the cabin was rougher than I expected, narrow, lined with dense trees whose branches interlaced overhead, creating tunnels of shadow. The sun was low, casting long streaks of gold through the foliage, but the deeper I drove, the darker the forest seemed. There were signs warning of sharp turns, but more than once I wondered if anyone else had been down this road recently. The tires crunched over loose gravel, the occasional sound of a bird breaking the stillness, but otherwise nothing. When I finally saw the cabin, relief washed over me. It was small, made of weathered wood that had darkened with age, sitting in a clearing surrounded by pines and oaks. A small creek ran behind it, the water whispering quietly over rocks. Smoke curled from the chimney, though I knew no one was supposed to be there yet. I parked, grabbed my bags, and walked up the short path to the door. The lock clicked open smoothly, almost too smoothly, and the inside smelled of dust, wood polish, and something faintly metallic. The cabin was simple. A small kitchen on one side, a fireplace in the center, and a bedroom that took up most of the back. There was an old, sagging couch and a table with 2 chairs. I unpacked slowly, savoring the quiet, the way the floorboards creaked softly under my weight. Outside, The forest pressed close against the windows, and the sound of the creek was constant, almost hypnotic. I set up a small lamp in the corner, something that would give off soft light in the evenings, and then went to explore. There was a path behind the cabin that followed the creek. I walked along it, letting the sound of the water and the wind through the trees fill my head. I noticed small details, the way moss grew in patches on stones, the faint tracks of animals in the mud, the occasional snap of a twig under my foot. The deeper I went, the more I realized how alone I was. There were no other cabins, no roads, nothing but forest. I liked that feeling at first. That night, I made a small fire in the fireplace. The wood crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney. The light threw dancing shadows across the walls, and I sat on the couch staring at them, letting the solitude wash over me. I had brought a notebook and a pen, thinking I might write. But as the fire burned lower, the shadows seemed to grow more restless. I tried to shake off the feeling. It was just the mind, overthinking, being alone in a place it wasn't used to. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the cabin, made me flinch. At some point, I realized I could hear something else. A faint scratching, almost like claws on wood. My heart started racing. I checked the doors and windows, all secure. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a squirrel, something small, and tried to go back to sleep. Morning came slow. Sunlight leaked through the blinds, illuminating dust motes in the air. I felt tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Outside, the forest was alive with birds and insects. I made breakfast, trying to shake off the unease from the night. Then I decided to explore more, to push further down the paths I hadn't walked yet. The day passed in a blur of trees, rocks, and undergrowth. I noticed how silent it could be in spots where the creek didn't run. The absence of sound was almost tangible, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I found signs of wildlife, deer tracks, a fox trail, but nothing that made a sound close enough to confirm I wasn't alone. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, feeling a creeping sense of tension I couldn't explain. That evening, I heard the scratching again, louder, more persistent. It came from outside the cabin, near the back where the creek ran. I stayed by the fireplace, the lamp casting a narrow cone of light across the room. The sound didn't stop. Then I thought I heard something else, a low thump like a branch hitting the roof, followed by movement across the porch. My pulse quickened. I checked the doors again, all locked. I considered going outside to see, but something inside me screamed to stay put. I spent the night wide awake, every sound magnified. There were moments when I swore I could hear footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. At one point, I saw a shadow pass the window. I froze. My mind raced with possibilities. Someone could be out there, or maybe it really was just an animal. I told myself that, yes, it was an animal, but that didn't stop the cold sweat running down my back. The next day, I tried to keep busy. I cleaned the cabin, fixed a leaky faucet, and tried to explore some more. As I walked along a trail I hadn't taken, I found footprints. Human footprints, heavy, booted, heading deeper into the forest. I stopped, my stomach dropping. I considered turning back, but curiosity, mixed with a strange sense of dread, kept me moving forward. I followed them for a while, the tracks inconsistent, as if whoever had made them had been moving slowly, stopping, changing directions. Eventually, they vanished near a cluster of fallen trees. I couldn't tell if they had turned off into another path or disappeared into the forest itself. Back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the unease. That night, the noises returned, more insistent, more purposeful. The scratching and the thumps were joined by something else. A dragging sound, slow and heavy, moving around the cabin. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake, sitting against the door with a heavy flashlight in my hand, waiting, listening. By the third day, I realized I was tense in every muscle. My food supplies were low. I considered leaving, but I had already driven hours into the forest. The roads were narrow, the forest thick. Leaving felt like navigating a maze. Still, I knew I had to. I packed a small bag with essentials, just in case, and kept an eye on the perimeter. That evening, I heard them. Not one, but multiple sets of footsteps. Heavy boots, careful, deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart felt like it was pounding in my ears. I didn't know if they were hunters, poachers, or people who had been living illegally in the forest. I didn't know what they wanted, but instinct screamed to hide, to find something solid between me and them. I stayed put until night fully descended, then made a plan. I had seen the creek from the back. It ran downhill, eventually merging with a larger waterway. I figured I could follow it, and if the people were around, they would have to choose whether to follow me or not. I waited for the faintest bit of moonlight, then moved. I followed the creek carefully, slipping over rocks, ducking under low branches. My flashlight illuminated the water, the moss, the insects, the occasional frog. Every sound of breaking twig made me flinch. After what felt like hours, I realized I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept moving. Eventually, I came to a small road, paved and clear. Relief washed over me. I ran onto it, waving my flashlight at any car that might pass. After what felt like an eternity, a pickup truck appeared. I ran toward it, screaming until the driver pulled over. The driver was shocked, but he took me to the nearest town, where I called the police and then my friends. I couldn't stop shaking for hours. The police searched the area, but they found no one near the cabin. No signs of recent habitation beyond my own discovery of the footprints. Still, I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. Weeks later, I returned briefly to collect my things. The cabin stood quietly, the forest undisturbed, almost as if it had been waiting for me to leave. I inspected every inch carefully. There were scratches near the back door, shallow and jagged, like someone had been trying to test if it was locked. There were small piles of broken branches, deliberate placements, almost as if someone had been circling the cabin while I slept. But no one was there. I left the cabin for the last time that day, taking the long road back to the city. The forest grew quiet behind me, the sunlight filtering through the trees in golden streaks. I couldn't explain what had happened fully, only that I had survived something I couldn't see clearly, something human, but with intentions I could not predict. I told myself that some people lived in those woods illegally, hunters or squatters, but even rational explanations didn't erase the memory of being trapped, isolated, and stalked in that small wooden cabin. Even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about the forest, about the scratches on the door, the footprints in the dirt, the slow, deliberate dragging sounds at night. I can't forget how powerless I felt, how completely alone I was. But I am alive, and I know that sometimes survival is about paying attention, trusting your instincts, and moving when the shadows seem to press too close. That cabin was a lesson in human fear, in real, tangible danger, and I survived because I didn't wait for something supernatural to save me. The forest is still there, and sometimes I wonder if the people who made those tracks are still moving quietly among the trees. But the road is clearer now. I know how to read it, how to listen, how to act. And that knowledge, that careful attention to detail, is what saved me. I have never gone back to that cabin, and I never will. But the memory is sharp, a reminder that the world can be quiet and still on the surface, and yet full of danger just beyond what you can see. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. After months of work that left me exhausted and numb, I decided to rent a small cabin deep in the forest, away from any towns, roads, or people. The cabin was advertised online as rustic but cozy, with a small wood stove, running water from a well, and no neighbors for miles. It sounded perfect, a place to be completely alone and let my mind rest. I packed a few days of food, extra blankets, a first aid kit, my flashlight, and enough firewood to last me the weekend. I was careful about planning everything because I had read too many stories about people getting stuck or hurt in the woods. The drive out was long, winding through narrow roads with tall trees pressing on both sides. I could feel the change in air as I left the town behind. The smells of smoke and traffic gave way to damp soil and pine. The road eventually turned to dirt and gravel, with ruts deep enough that my car scraped sometimes. I kept driving slowly, making sure I didn't get a flat or hit a rock. After what felt like forever, I finally saw it. A small cabin with a wooden porch, sitting alone in a clearing, surrounded by thick forest in every direction. A thin chimney puffed out smoke from the previous tenants, or perhaps the caretaker, though no one was there when I arrived. I parked, unloaded my things, and stepped onto the porch. The silence hit me immediately. No cars, no birds, no wind through the trees. Just stillness. It was the kind of quiet that made every small sound, my own breathing, my footsteps, feel enormous. I tried not to let it bother me and went inside. The cabin was small but clean. There was a kitchen corner with a small stove and sink, a table, a few chairs, a couch, a bed in the back, and a bathroom. Windows faced every side, letting in the gray light of the late afternoon. I placed my bags down and took a moment to breathe. Finally, I was alone, completely alone, and it felt good. I decided to start a fire. The wood stove was old but functional. After arranging the wood, I struck a match, and the fire caught, filling the cabin with warmth and a soft, steady light. I unpacked my food, boiled water, and made a simple dinner. Sitting by the fire, I felt the tension of the week slowly leave my shoulders. Outside, the forest pressed in, dark and silent. I watched the flames dance and thought about sleeping early to wake up refreshed. Night came fast. With no electricity, the cabin relied entirely on the fire and my flashlight. I double-checked that the doors and windows were locked. Everything seemed fine. I went to bed, feeling safe under heavy blankets. The first night passed uneventfully, with only the occasional creak of the cabin settling and distant noises from animals in the forest. The next morning, I woke early, feeling refreshed. The sun filtered in through the trees, creating streaks of light across the wooden floor. I made coffee and watched the forest wake up, birds calling, squirrels moving through the underbrush. I decided to explore a little. There was a small path behind the cabin, not maintained, but it seemed to lead further into the woods. I grabbed my backpack with water, a map, and my flashlight and started walking. The forest was dense, but the air was fresh, and I felt alive. After an hour, I realized I had walked farther than I expected. The path became less obvious, overgrown with bushes and fallen branches. I considered turning back but wanted to see how far it went. Eventually, I came to a small creek, the sound of running water breaking the forest's quiet. I followed it for a while, fascinated by the clarity of the water, the moss-covered rocks, and the way the sun touched everything. Eventually, I decided it was time to return, noticing the shadows lengthening. I thought I remembered the way back, but soon I realized the forest looked unfamiliar. The trees all looked the same, the path I had followed seemed gone. I tried to backtrack, but every direction seemed wrong. Panic started to rise. I had my map, but without a visible path, I couldn't orient myself. I walked and walked, hoping to see the cabin, but nothing looked familiar. My heart pounded, my hands were sweaty, and I could feel the adrenaline making me shake. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower, and I realized I was in real trouble. My flashlight was still working, but I was alone, in dense forest, without a clear path, and night was coming. I stopped to rest by a large tree, sitting on a fallen log. I tried to calm myself. Panicking would only make things worse. I drank some water, ate a small snack, and considered my options. I could try to stay put and wait for morning, but that would be dangerous if I had to survive the night alone in the forest. I decided to keep moving, hoping to stumble back toward the cabin. Night fell fully. The forest was black, and the sounds changed. Birds were silent. The only noises were twigs snapping under my feet and something moving in the underbrush. I couldn't see what it was, but the thought of a wild animal made my stomach churn. I tried to move quietly, staying alert, keeping my flashlight ready. Every shadow felt like it was watching me, and every sound made me jump. I forced myself to focus on breathing, on each step, on staying calm. At some point, I tripped over a root and fell hard. My knee and elbow were scraped, and I lost my water bottle. I cursed silently and checked myself. Nothing was broken, but the pain reminded me of my vulnerability. I pressed on, carefully now, using the flashlight to watch the ground and surrounding trees. Hours dragged by. My energy was draining, my legs were sore, and I began to feel cold. Eventually, I realized I was going in circles. The forest seemed endless, and my confidence was fading. Then I remembered the creek. Maybe if I could find it, I could follow it back. Water often led to habitation. I backtracked as best I could, listening for the sound of running water. Hours passed. Just when I was about to give up, I heard it. A faint gurgle of a creek. Relief flooded me. I followed it carefully, marking trees with my flashlight as I went, making sure I didn't lose it again. The creek led me to a familiar clearing. The cabin was there, just as I had left it, smoke still curling from the chimney. My legs were trembling as I ran the last few yards. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and collapsed on the floor by the fire. I was exhausted, sore, hungry, and scared, but I was safe. I tended the fire, boiled water, cleaned my scrapes as best I could, and ate a small meal. I sat by the fire for hours, staring at the flames, thinking about what had happened, how easily things could have gone wrong, and how careful I would have to be. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin, rebuilding my energy. I gathered firewood, organized my supplies, and explored only a few meters around the clearing. I made mental notes of landmarks, marked trees, and planned for any emergencies. I realized how fragile safety was in the wilderness, how quickly isolation could turn from peaceful to dangerous. By the end of the second day, I felt stronger and more in control, though wary. I had survived the worst part of being alone in the forest: the disorientation, the fear, and the physical challenge. When it came time to leave, I packed everything carefully, feeling a mix of relief and accomplishment. The drive back was quiet, but I noticed every detail: the turns in the road, the trees, the small details I had ignored on the way in. I felt a deep appreciation for preparation, caution, and respect for nature. Even weeks later, I could remember every detail of that weekend. Every creaking branch, every moment of fear, every struggle to stay calm. The experience stayed with me, not as a ghost story, not as a fairy tale, but as a real memory of survival, of facing fear, and of learning the importance of preparation, observation, and patience. It changed the way I approached life. I became more careful, more aware, more resilient. I knew now that fear could be faced, and that being alone in the wilderness was not about spirits or magic. It was about skill, awareness, and staying alive. The cabin itself remained a memory of the danger and the calm that came after, a lesson etched into me forever. I had driven into the woods in late October, the kind of late autumn where the air was sharp and cold, the kind that bites at the skin even through layers of clothing. I had rented a small cabin about 100 miles from the nearest town, a place I had found online through a barely known website. It promised solitude, isolation, and a chance to disconnect from everything. I was looking for quiet, a reprieve from city noise and endless human chatter, though I did not anticipate that the quiet itself could be a kind of danger. The drive had been long, through roads lined with trees that had already lost most of their leaves, leaving twisted, bare branches reaching toward the gray sky. The map I had printed out at home guided me along roads that narrowed into dirt paths, which became rutted and uneven, making the car bounce harshly with each dip and ridge. I noticed no other cars, no signs of life beyond the occasional crow taking flight at the sound of my tires. The silence felt like it was pressing down on me, even through the hum of the engine. I had imagined a cozy, inviting cabin, tucked into the woods and waiting like a secret. What I found was far more remote than I had expected. The cabin sat on a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines that blocked most of the dim afternoon light. The wood of the cabin was weathered and gray, some of the boards warped and cracked from years of exposure. A stone chimney leaned slightly to one side, and smoke was curling faintly from it, though no one was visible anywhere. I parked in a small clearing in front, noting the uneven stones and the thick carpet of fallen leaves beneath the tires. My first impression was that the cabin was deserted for a long time, or maybe maintained sporadically. The air smelled damp and earthy, carrying the faint scent of rotting leaves and pine resin. Inside, the cabin was dim but navigable. Dust hung in the air, thick in the corners and along the ceiling beams. The main room had a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, blackened from long use. The furniture was sparse, rough wood chairs and a single table, both scarred and worn. A small kitchen area held a few pots and pans, but they were rusty and stained. I had brought my own supplies, though, planning for a stay of a few days. The floor creaked under my weight as I explored further, the sound unusually loud in the silence of the cabin. There were 2 small bedrooms, each containing a thin mattress and a blanket, yellowed with age. Nothing else of note was in the rooms except cobwebs and the scent of mold. That first night, I tried to settle in, lighting a fire in the fireplace and stacking some wood I had brought from the car. The logs hissed and popped as they burned, throwing long shadows across the walls. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows and the shutters. I was alone, completely alone, and I felt it in my chest, a tension that I couldn't shake. I told myself I was here to rest, to escape, but the isolation gnawed at the edges of my mind. Every creak of the cabin, every branch snapping outside, made me glance toward the windows, half expecting to see someone standing there. The thought was absurd, but the fear was real. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept imagining sounds. Footsteps outside, the thud of a branch against the cabin, whispers that weren't there. In the middle of the night, I woke to a low, persistent tapping at the window. My heart jumped, and I froze listening. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. Tap, tap. I realized it was the wind. The branch of a tree was swaying and hitting the window in irregular rhythm. Relief washed over me slowly, but the adrenaline didn't fade. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, listening to the forest breathe. The next day, I explored the surrounding area. The cabin was on a small hill, and a stream ran a short distance away, partially hidden by fallen leaves and brush. I noted the paths leading away from the cabin. One appeared to lead to a larger clearing, the other disappeared into thick undergrowth. As I walked, I realized how easy it would be to get lost. Every tree looked alike. Every turn seemed familiar and confusing. I marked my trail on a tree with a small knife, carving shallow lines into the bark so I could find my way back. I had brought a compass, but the forest was dense, and the terrain uneven. Later that evening, I noticed something unusual. Footprints in the dirt outside the cabin, pressed into the soft ground near the door. They were not mine. They were smaller, lighter, the shape of shoes or boots, and they led away from the cabin into the forest. I stared at them for a long time, unsure of what to make of it. The wind had been strong, but it did not erase these prints. They were real and someone had been here. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, feeling a tightening in my chest. The sun was setting, and the shadows stretched long across the ground, darkening the forest. That night, sleep was even harder. I kept imagining someone outside, watching, crouched among the trees. I convinced myself that the footprints could have been old, that maybe an animal or a hiker had passed during the day. Still, every sound made me tense. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't just the window this time. Something moved in the shadows near the cabin. Something heavy, deliberate. I stayed in bed, frozen, listening until exhaustion finally overcame fear. The next morning, I decided to leave the cabin, though I had planned to stay 3 days. I packed quickly, double-checking everything. As I walked to the car, I noticed new footprints, larger this time, closer to the clearing, leading toward the cabin. They hadn't been there the day before. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here overnight. I could not see them, but the tracks proved their presence. I left quickly, driving back toward the main road, eyes darting constantly to the forest. The road wound and twisted, and I felt the panic growing with each mile. The isolation that had once felt like a relief now pressed against me. I thought about the cabin, the footprints, and the subtle signs that someone had been monitoring me. The fear was real, physical, and it stayed with me long after I reached civilization. Days later, I reported the incident to local authorities. They searched the area but found nothing unusual. The cabin was inspected and deemed structurally sound, but no one admitted to staying there. I could not explain the footprints or the sense of being watched. The experience left a permanent mark on me. I stopped seeking solitude in remote places. Even now, years later, I can remember the cold wind pressing against the windows, the creak of the floorboards, and the feeling of being utterly alone, and yet not entirely. I had been driving for hours, the tires crunching over the gravel roads that cut through the forest like pale scars. The sun was low, barely above the horizon, and its light filtered through the tall pines in streaks, making long shadows that seemed to move as I passed them. I was heading to a cabin I had rented for a solo weekend, a small wooden structure tucked deep in the mountains. I had needed the isolation, a break from the constant noise of the city, the traffic, the people. There was something about being alone in the woods, hearing nothing but wind and birds, that I found soothing. The last turnoff was narrow and barely marked. I slowed the car, careful not to miss it. The road twisted sharply, dipping down into a small valley before rising again, flanked on both sides by dense trees. The air felt cooler here, and I rolled the window down a little to feel it, the smell of pine needles and damp earth filling the car. I remembered reading that wildlife here could be unpredictable, but I had never been particularly afraid of bears or wolves. I told myself to stay alert and avoid hiking at night. The cabin appeared as I crested the final hill, a small, single-story building made of weathered wood. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, but there was no sign of life around it. The porch sagged slightly under the weight of years, and I could see the door was locked with a simple key mechanism. I parked and grabbed my bags, stepping onto the creaking wooden boards. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp moss. I had arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest seemed to swallow the light quickly. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and mildew. Dust floated in the last rays of sunlight filtering through the windows. The furniture was sparse but functional. A small table, a couple of chairs, a couch that looked like it had been here for decades, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. The kitchen was tiny, with a small fridge, a gas stove, and a few cabinets stocked with some basic supplies, canned food, jars of pasta, and a small pack of bottled water. The bedroom had a simple bed with a thin mattress, and a window that looked out over the dense trees. I unpacked my bags slowly, careful not to rush. I wanted to settle in, to breathe, and to let the quietness of the forest sink in. I lit the stove to warm the cabin. The fire crackled and popped, throwing uneven shadows across the walls. It felt safe. I had been here a few minutes when I noticed it, the first sound that seemed out of place. A soft scratching noise from outside, near the back of the cabin. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the wall, but then it came again, more deliberate. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I froze, trying to tell myself it was an animal, probably a raccoon or a deer brushing against the cabin. I checked the windows. They were locked and the screens were intact. The sound didn't persist long, and eventually it stopped. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking. The woods were alive with sounds I wasn't used to, and my mind was only making them feel threatening. The night fell fast. The darkness outside was almost physical, pressing against the windows, hiding everything beyond a few feet. I lit a lantern and settled on the couch with a book, though I couldn't concentrate. Every time a branch scraped or a gust of wind rattled the siding, I jumped. I realized how much the isolation was affecting me. The cabin felt like it had been forgotten by the world, and I was entirely on my own. At some point, I heard another noise, this time from inside the cabin itself. A creak from the hallway. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I reminded myself that the house was old, that wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes. Still, I checked the door to the bedroom and made sure it was locked. I didn't want to sleep in a room that felt unsafe. I decided to sleep in the living area, close to the stove where I could see the door. Sleep was fitful. Every small noise, The wind through the trees, the snapping of twigs outside, the occasional rustle, kept me half awake, tense. Around 3 a.m., I woke fully, drenched in sweat. I had heard something, footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I froze, straining to hear, my mind racing. The forest was quiet otherwise. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the table and quietly approached the door. The light swept across the porch. Nothing, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. I leaned my ear to the door. A soft, low thump against the siding. Someone or something was definitely out there. I remembered the small hunting knife I had packed. I kept it in my pocket as I slowly backed away from the door, trying to decide what to do. I could drive back to town, call the police, or try to wait it out until daylight. I chose to wait. I sat near the stove, knife in hand, eyes darting toward the windows. Hours passed. The thumping continued sporadically, sometimes near the front, sometimes near the back. Whoever it was, they were circling the cabin. The night lasted forever. Every time I thought I might doze off, a new sound jolted me awake. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the noises stopped. I slowly crept to the door and looked outside. Footprints had been left in the soft mud. Large boots, circling the cabin. Whoever had been here had left while it was still dark, leaving no sign of breaking in or causing damage, but I realized just how close they had been. The idea that someone had watched me all night made my stomach churn. I decided to leave immediately. I packed quickly, double-checking that nothing was left behind. The car started without a problem, and I drove away from the cabin as fast as I could, eyes scanning the tree line for any movement. The roads were still empty, but I kept my flashlight ready, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. By the time I reached the main highway, I had calmed somewhat, though my heart still raced. I found a gas station, called the police, and reported the footprints. They promised someone would check it out, though they made it clear that they couldn't guarantee anything. Later, I learned from the authorities that a group of local squatters had been known to hide in abandoned cabins in the area. They would watch, sometimes follow hikers, and disappear before anyone could confront them. I realized how lucky I had been. A few feet more toward the door at the wrong moment could have been disastrous. Eventually, I stayed in a motel for the next few nights, recovering from the tension and fear that had consumed me. I promised myself I would never go back to that cabin, never try the isolation again without knowing exactly what, or who, might be there. The memory of that night stayed with me, and I could still feel the shadows pressing against the windows, hear the soft thumping, and see the boot prints circling the cabin. A reminder that danger could hide anywhere, even in a place that seemed empty and quiet. I still tell the story to myself over and over, analyzing every decision I made, imagining how it could have gone differently. The experience taught me caution, respect for the wilderness, and an understanding that even when you think you are alone, you might not be. Weeks later, I returned to the city and resumed my life. I avoided the woods entirely, sticking to crowded parks and urban trails. I kept a small knife in my bag, more out of habit than necessity, and always checked the surrounding area before stopping anywhere remotely isolated. I realized that the fear I had felt wasn't irrational. It was a warning. And in that cabin, alone in the dark, I had been forced to pay attention, to survive by relying only on myself. Over time, the fear faded, but the memory remained vivid. Every time I see a dense forest or a deserted cabin, I feel that tension return, that sense of being watched. I no longer romanticize solitude in the wild. Isolation isn't peaceful. It's dangerous if you aren't prepared. I learned that lesson fully, painfully, in that cabin. And even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, certain I hear a soft, deliberate step outside my window, reminding me that some parts of the world are better left unseen. I had been driving all day through the narrow, twisting roads of the mountains, the kind of roads that felt like they were built for people who already knew every curve by heart. I had rented the cabin for a week, hoping to get away from the city, the constant noise, and the crowds. The air at the higher elevations smelled like wet pine and cold earth, a smell I always associated with being alive in a way I never felt in the city. When I finally arrived, the sun was beginning to dip behind the ridge to the west, casting long shadows over the sparse trees and the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was an old cabin, made of dark wood that had weathered and cracked with age, with a steep roof and a small porch. There were signs of neglect. The paint on the window frames had chipped off, the railing on the porch was wobbly, but it seemed solid enough. I parked my car in front of the cabin and grabbed my backpack. The air was already colder than I expected, a biting cold that made my lungs tighten and my skin tingle. The mountains always held a chill in the evening, even in late spring. I stepped up onto the porch, testing the steps one by one. They creaked, and I had to steady myself against the railing. The cabin door opened easily, and inside, it smelled like damp wood, old carpet, and a hint of mildew. Dust motes floated in the shafts of fading sunlight coming through the small windows. I put down my bag and began exploring. The cabin had a small living area with a sofa that sagged in the middle, a wooden table, and a few chairs. A wood-burning stove stood in the corner, blackened from use. The kitchen was tiny, with cupboards and a sink that looked functional enough, though I did not check the plumbing immediately. The bedroom was small, with a twin bed covered in a thin blanket and a small dresser. There was a loft above the living area, accessed by a narrow wooden ladder, which I did not climb yet. I had come prepared with a flashlight, a few blankets, canned food, and enough water for a few days. I unpacked quickly and decided to make a small fire in the stove. I had brought firewood from the city, stacked in my car. Striking a match was almost ceremonial in that quiet space. Once the fire took, the cabin became warmer, and the flickering flames cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. I sat for a while, just listening to the creaking of the cabin as it settled and the occasional sound of wind rattling through the trees outside. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I was tired, so I went to bed early, hoping to wake up refreshed for a hike the next morning. I had not expected to be woken in the middle of the night by a sound so sharp it made me sit straight up in bed. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps an animal brushing against the cabin, but the sound repeated, light, deliberate tapping, like someone tapping a stick against the wooden wall of the porch. My heart raced. I stayed very still, listening, the firelight barely illuminating the room. The tapping stopped after a few moments, but the tension it left behind made it impossible to sleep. I got my flashlight and quietly moved to the door, peering out into the darkness. The porch was empty. The trees beyond swayed, but nothing moved among them, nothing that looked like a person. I tried to convince myself it was a raccoon, a bear, or some other animal, but as I went back to bed, the sense of being watched did not leave. Every small noise, the cracking of a branch, the shifting of the roof in the wind, made me tense. I lay awake for hours listening. It became a rhythm, the wind, the trees, and then a subtle, irregular tapping that always seemed to come from somewhere near the porch. The next morning, I forced myself to shake it off. I had planned to hike a trail near a small lake a few miles up the road. I dressed, packed my day bag, and left, telling myself that being out in the open air would calm my nerves. The trail was steep, overgrown in places, but beautiful. The lake was clear, reflecting the sky in a way that made the mountains around it look even taller. I spent hours walking, taking photos, and even fishing a little, though I caught nothing. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was low again, casting shadows over the trees. I was exhausted, and I wanted nothing more than to make a fire, eat, and sleep. As I approached, I noticed something unsettling. My car, which I had parked facing the cabin, had something on the windshield. A smear of mud, deliberately placed, not a random splatter, but a long streak, like someone had wiped their hand across it. My stomach dropped. I checked around the car. Footprints, small, deliberate, coming from the tree line near the road and circling the cabin. Someone had been here while I was gone. I did not panic immediately, but I was careful. I went inside, locked the doors, and sat down to think. The footsteps outside continued, light steps on the dry leaves, sometimes fading, sometimes closer. The tapping returned in the evening, but now it was accompanied by other sounds. Scraping, like something being dragged across the porch. I stayed near the door, flashlight in hand, waiting, calculating. The rational part of me told me that maybe it was a hunter, maybe someone else renting cabins nearby, maybe a prankster, but another part of me knew that there was no one supposed to be here. I did not sleep that night. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move toward me. I kept the fire going, even as the wood dwindled, and when it burned low, I moved candles closer to the walls, hoping to see any intruder before they could see me. At one point, I swore I saw a figure crouching near the edge of the clearing outside a window. I froze, barely breathing. The figure did not move, and then it was gone. I checked the windows, the locks, and even the back door. Everything seemed intact. The next day, I decided I could not stay. I packed my bag quickly and planned to drive down the mountain, back to the city. But as I opened the cabin door, my stomach sank again. Tire tracks, not mine, had appeared in the dirt road leading to the cabin. Heavy tracks, wide and deep, as if a truck had been here. They led from the road into the trees near the cabin and disappeared. My car was exactly where I had left it, but now there was a faint smell of gasoline, and the doors were slightly damp, as if someone had touched them. I considered calling the police, but there was no cell service. I was completely isolated. I debated hiking down the road, but the thought of leaving the cabin and being seen by whoever had been there terrified me. I realized I had to fortify myself as best as possible. I brought every heavy object in the cabin, chairs, tables, against the doors and windows, and kept the fire going during the day and night, using every scrap of wood I had. I slept with the flashlight in my hand, every muscle tensed, every sense alert. Days passed like this. I did not see the figure again, but I could feel it. The footprints around the cabin never changed, always fresh, as if someone was circling, waiting. At one point, I discovered my water container had been moved slightly. Food had been nibbled, not by animals, but by someone who knew I was here. The realization hit me hard. This was not random. This was intentional. Someone was watching me, testing me, or preparing for something worse. I began thinking of escape strategies constantly. I memorized the paths through the trees, noted every rock, every incline that could give me cover. I collected sticks and rocks to use as weapons. I set small traps, noisy ones, out around the porch and windows to give me an early warning. I slept in shifts, never more than a couple of hours at a time. The tension was unrelenting. Finally, after a week of near-constant anxiety, I saw my opportunity. Early morning, when the forest was filled with mist and the figure had not appeared, I decided to leave on foot, taking the path that led to the main road. I left all non-essential belongings in the cabin. Every sound made my heart pound. Every shadow seemed alive. I moved quickly, carefully, trying to avoid leaving a clear trail, but I had no real plan except to get out. After hours of walking, slipping, hiding behind trees, and crawling over fallen logs, I finally reached a point where I could see the road. A car passed slowly, and I waved frantically. The driver stopped, a man with a startled expression. I did not speak much, just got in and asked him to take me down the mountain. Back in the city, the fear began to ebb slowly, though the memories of that week never left. The cabin, which had seemed like a peaceful retreat, became a place I could never return to. I reported the intrusion to the local authorities, but with no evidence. Footprints washed away by rain, no physical confrontation. They could do little. The thought of the person who had been so close, watching, waiting, planning, lingered in my mind for months. Eventually, I returned to the mountains, but never to a cabin alone. I learned to hike and camp with others, always aware of surroundings, always prepared. That experience taught me a lesson I will never forget. In isolation, the world can feel safe and peaceful one moment and utterly dangerous the next, and sometimes the scariest threats are the ones you cannot see, cannot name, and cannot predict. The cabin still exists. I have driven past it once since, from a distance, the same old dark wood in the clearing. It looks empty, quiet, innocent, but I know better. The footprints, the movements, the watching figure, those are memories that will not fade. And yet, I survived, and I carry with me the knowledge and vigilance to ensure that I never again find myself alone, unprepared, and at the mercy of someone who knows exactly how to frighten another human being without ever revealing themselves. That was the reality of that week. The fear, the meticulous observation, the relentless tension. And I survived it, intact, alive, and wiser. I had been driving for hours, the road twisting through the dense forest like a black ribbon unraveling into the dark. The sky was gray and heavy, threatening rain, and the trees pressed close on either side of the narrow lane, their branches clawing toward the road like skeletal hands. I had rented the cabin weeks ago, thinking it would be the perfect retreat from the city, a place to escape the constant noise and the endless obligations. I had imagined sitting on the porch with a coffee, listening to the wind through the pines, the forest quiet except for the occasional bird or the rustle of deer through the underbrush. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. It was old but sturdy, built of rough-hewn logs that had darkened with age. Moss clung to the roof, and the chimney leaned slightly to one side, like it had survived storms that had tested it for decades. The driveway ended abruptly at a small clearing, and beyond it, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, dark and silent. I parked the car, the gravel crunching under the tires, and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension that had built up from the long drive. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and wood, the faintly sweet scent of pine lingering in the corners. There was a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a loft above where I planned to sleep. Everything was simple, functional, and quiet. I unpacked slowly, trying to savor the solitude. Outside, the wind started to pick up, rattling the window panes, and I could hear the trees creaking and groaning as if the forest itself were moving. That first night, I slept fitfully. The cabin was older than I had realized, and every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The wind, the trees, the roof settling. It all combined into a low, constant hum that kept me half awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, crunching on the gravel, but when I sat up and peered through the window, there was nothing. Only the black, endless forest, the way it seemed to absorb all light and sound. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, or maybe an animal, but the feeling of being watched lingered like a shadow at the edge of my mind. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest was thick, the ground uneven with roots and fallen branches. Sunlight barely reached the floor, filtered through the high canopy. I noticed animal tracks, some recent, some older, and I tried to identify them: deer, maybe a fox, a raccoon. Everything seemed normal until I stumbled upon a small clearing where the underbrush had been trampled in a strange pattern. It looked like someone, or something, had been walking back and forth, over and over. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen anyone else in the forest, and the nearest road was miles away. I went back to the cabin and double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure, but the unease lingered. That night, the wind picked up again, stronger this time, rattling the windows like a drum. I had left the lights off to save electricity, and the cabin felt darker, smaller, more confining. Somewhere outside, a branch snapped sharply, closer than before, and my pulse quickened. I stayed in bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, but sleep was elusive. Every few minutes, a sound would make me jump, a rustle, a crack, a long, slow drag through the underbrush that I couldn't identify. By the third day, I had started keeping the flashlight and my phone within arm's reach at all times. I had also started carrying a heavy kitchen knife whenever I went outside, just in case. The forest seemed more alive now, more oppressive, and the air had a damp, earthy smell that reminded me of decay. I kept hearing the sounds, low and deliberate, as if someone were walking just out of sight, watching me. I would step out onto the porch, trying to peer into the trees, but all I could see were shadows. I knew I was alone, yet the feeling of eyes on me was undeniable. One evening, I was chopping firewood when I heard a snapping sound behind me. I froze, the axe in my hands, and strained my eyes in the failing light. There was nothing, just the trees, the forest floor, and the dim gray sky. I shook my head and told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, a raccoon, or a stray dog. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Something about the way the snapping had sounded was deliberate, measured, like it had purpose. The following night, the wind was worse than ever. It banged against the cabin, moaning through the eaves, and I could hear things moving just outside the windows. I stayed awake, holding the knife, watching the darkness. And then I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, moving slowly among the trees, just beyond the range of the porch light. I froze, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the shadows, a combination of wind and branches. But it moved, gliding almost silently, stopping whenever I shifted my gaze. I could feel its presence, the way it seemed to follow me without sound, without breaking the trees. I realized then that I wasn't alone, and that this wasn't random. I spent the rest of the night in the loft, huddled under blankets, listening to the sound of someone, or something, circling the cabin. When dawn finally came, I peeked through the window. There was nothing. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. The forest looked peaceful, almost idyllic in the pale morning light. I wanted to leave immediately, but the road was muddy, and the car tires had sunk slightly into the soft gravel. I had no choice but to stay a little longer, and that knowledge made the entire morning unbearable. I had always been drawn to the isolation of the woods, the chaos of the city, the constant noise, the endless stream of people pressing against each other, had long since grown unbearable. I needed to feel the quiet of the world, to be surrounded by nothing but trees, the occasional bird, the wind rustling through the branches. It wasn't a sudden decision. I had been planning this trip for months, carefully selecting a cabin in the northern reaches of the forest that promised solitude and simplicity. The cabin was advertised as off-grid, and that was exactly what I wanted. No electricity, no running water, no distractions. Just me, the forest, and the silence. When I arrived, the road leading up to it was worse than I expected. The last few miles were little more than a dirt track, overgrown with grass and tree roots that pushed through the soil like the veins of the earth itself. My car, a small SUV, rattled with every bump and hollow patch. The sun was already low, spilling orange light through the dense canopy. Shadows stretched long and deep, and the air smelled like wet earth and pine. I felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with unease. Part of me loved the quiet, but part of me also wondered if the isolation would be overwhelming. The cabin came into view just as the light began to fade. It was small, made entirely of rough, untreated wood, with a steep roof and a single chimney that promised a working fireplace. The windows were dirty and fogged over, but I could see the outline of furniture inside. A simple bed, a table, a chair, and a wood stove. Around it, the forest pressed close, trees towering over the structure, and behind it, a small clearing that opened to a slow, narrow stream. I parked my car at the edge of the clearing and stepped out. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled faintly of smoke, even though no fire burned. It felt alive, the kind of quiet that hums just beneath your ears, full of sounds you barely notice until you realize how still everything else is. I spent the first hour unpacking, laying out my sleeping bag, and stacking firewood neatly near the stove. I had brought food, water, and basic supplies, intending to spend the weekend alone. I wanted to see if I could handle it. The silence, the isolation, the feeling of being utterly alone in a place where no one could hear you. The sun set fully, leaving me in the gray dim of early night. I lit a fire, the flames snapping and hissing, and sat in the chair near the stove. The warmth spread slowly through my body, and I felt a measure of calm settle over me. I was safe here. At least I thought I was. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept fitfully, waking once or twice to the sound of the wind, the occasional snap of a branch against the cabin wall, the distant call of a bird or a small animal moving in the undergrowth. In the morning, the sun broke through the trees, painting the cabin and the clearing with golden light. I spent the day exploring the area, following the stream, stepping carefully over roots and rocks, noting the tracks of deer and small animals in the soft soil. The world felt vast and alive, yet also utterly removed from human civilization. That night, though, things began to feel different. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose shutters and making the trees sway in a way that cast long, moving shadows across the cabin walls. I noticed it immediately as I tried to light the fire. The matches felt damp, and the kindling refused to catch. I finally managed it after several attempts, and the fire glowed weakly, barely enough to keep me warm. I told myself it was nothing, just bad weather, an isolated cabin, normal things. But the feeling of being watched began to creep in. Not by anyone in particular, just the sensation that the forest itself was aware of me, that the shadows were heavier than they should be. I tried to ignore it. I kept busy the next day, chopping more firewood, walking further along the stream, noting the patterns of wildlife, the shapes of rocks, the angles of trees leaning in the direction of the wind. The cabin became a kind of center in the world I was inhabiting, and I felt almost as though it were a lifeline to reality. But by the evening, the sense of unease returned. The wind was stronger now, and with it came a subtle, almost imperceptible creaking from the walls. It sounded too deliberate, too timed, as if the cabin itself were breathing. I shook the thought away, telling myself it was just the wood settling. Then came the noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, a light tapping, rhythmic, coming from outside the cabin. I peered into the darkness beyond the window, trying to make out shapes in the night. The clearing was empty. No animals, no movement, just shadows dancing across the ground in the weak light of the dying fire. I went outside, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam over the trees, the undergrowth, the stream. Nothing. The forest seemed entirely still, and yet the tapping continued, now from a different direction, soft and steady, like someone or something was circling the cabin just beyond sight. Panic began to set in, though I fought it back. My rational mind reminded me that I was alone, that there was no one nearby, that any sound could easily be a falling branch, an animal scratching bark, a branch rubbing against another. I tried to convince myself of these things while patrolling the perimeter of the cabin with my flashlight. But after an hour, the tapping remained, always just out of the light's reach. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak, every gust of wind, every distant rustle made my heart jump. I kept the fire alive as long as I could, feeding it small sticks and dry leaves, but eventually the logs burned down. The cabin was plunged into near-complete darkness, the weak light of the moon filtering through the trees. I stayed awake until dawn, listening. Occasionally, I thought I could hear faint footsteps in the leaves, deliberate movements, pauses, then movement again. My imagination raced, conjuring threats, intruders, wild animals, anything that might explain the noises. When morning came, I ventured out to inspect the surroundings. Nothing seemed out of place at first. No signs of human presence, no evidence of tampering, no footprints beyond the animals. Yet in the clearing, I found something that made my stomach twist. A small circle of stones had been moved, rearranged, not in any natural pattern, but deliberately. It wasn't menacing in an obvious way, but it was enough to make me certain someone had been nearby, someone hiding, watching. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and more isolated than I had before. Over the next day, I began taking precautions. I checked the locks on the door, reinforced weak panels with my flashlight and pieces of firewood, and moved around the cabin more deliberately, keeping track of all points of possible entry. Yet even with these precautions, the sense of being watched persisted. At night, the tapping returned, softer now, like someone testing the boundaries of my awareness. I avoided the windows, keeping the curtains drawn, keeping the fire burning long into the night. Sleep was shallow, fragmented, haunted by the feeling of eyes in the darkness. It was the third night that the real scare happened. I was dozing in the chair near the stove, half asleep, when I felt it. A sudden, sharp movement outside, accompanied by a snapping of twigs so close it made me jerk upright. The firelight flickered against the walls, and in that moment, I glimpsed a shadow past the window, a tall figure, quick, purposeful. My heart leapt into my throat, and I grabbed the axe I had kept beside the chair. The figure vanished before I could even get a full look. I checked every inch of the cabin and the perimeter outside. Nothing. But now there was no doubt. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching me. Panic and fear ruled the night. I stayed awake, holding the axe, listening to every sound. Branches snapped, leaves rustled. The wind howled through the trees, and through it all, I felt the presence of someone waiting. I couldn't see them, couldn't confront them, could only endure. The night stretched endlessly, the dark pressing in, making the cabin feel impossibly small and fragile, like a thin barrier between safety and threat. In the morning, I made a plan. I would leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed my things hurriedly, storing them in the car, making sure everything was ready. As I stepped outside, I swept the area with my eyes and saw something that made me pause. A set of footprints led from the edge of the clearing toward the cabin, stopping abruptly near the back door. They were human, but careful, deliberate, as though whoever made them had been cautious to avoid being detected. My pulse raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I didn't wait. I started the car and drove slowly down the rough track, keeping my eyes on the tree line, aware that someone could be following. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming, the wind shaking branches overhead. But the road was long and difficult, and after nearly an hour, the cabin vanished behind me. The sense of danger slowly began to ease as I reached the main road, the first signs of civilization appearing. I could breathe again. I wasn't alone anymore. In retrospect, I realized several things. I had underestimated how exposed the cabin was, how easily someone could approach without being noticed, and how isolated even the strongest structure becomes when there's no one else around. The experience had been terrifying, but it had also taught me the importance of preparation and vigilance, of understanding the limits of solitude in a world that sometimes holds unseen threats. I had come seeking peace, quiet, and isolation, and I had found it. But I had also discovered that isolation carries its own dangers, and that sometimes the most frightening presence is not a ghost, not a monster, but a real person in the shadows, whose intentions remain unknown. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin, accompanied by a friend. We inspected it thoroughly, looking for signs of what had happened, but found nothing definitive. The circle of stones had been moved again, naturally, perhaps by animals or weather, and no tracks remained. The cabin stood quiet, undisturbed, as if the events of that night had never happened. I felt a measure of relief knowing it was empty, but I also felt a lasting respect for the forest and its secrets. I had survived, yes, but I had learned that safety in isolation is fragile, that the forest is both beautiful and indifferent, and that the smallest oversight can turn solitude into fear. I left the cabin that day with a renewed sense of awareness. I had conquered my fear in a way, had endured the nights and the shadows, but I had also gained a deeper understanding of my own vulnerability. The forest remained a place of beauty and wonder, but it was no longer naive serenity I sought. I knew now that being alone in such a place meant being prepared for every eventuality, for the quiet could hide more than just the wind, and even the most isolated cabin could never be entirely safe. I had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks, maybe even months. My job in the city was relentless, draining, and sometimes it felt like life was just a series of deadlines and fluorescent lights. I needed something different, something that would make me feel alive in a way that scrolling through emails or attending endless meetings never could. That's how I ended up renting a small, secluded cabin in the mountains, far from the nearest town, far from cell service, far from anything that could remind me of the life I wanted to leave behind for a couple of days. The advertisement on the site had seemed perfect. Rustic, isolated, surrounded by thick woods and a small creek. Pictures showed a cozy wooden cabin with a stone fireplace, a porch overlooking the forest, and a dirt road leading up to it. No neighbors within miles, just me and the trees. I packed my car with everything I thought I might need. Sleeping bag, warm clothes, food for 3 days, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a small gas stove. I even brought extra batteries for my headlamp and my phone, just in case. The drive itself was long, and the road narrowed quickly as I left the main highway. The pavement turned into gravel, and the trees became taller, closer together, darker. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, the sun was already low, slanting through the branches in a strange golden light. I felt my chest tighten with anticipation and a slight unease, though I chalked that up to excitement. The cabin was exactly as it had appeared in the photos. The wooden walls were weathered, but sturdy. The porch creaked slightly under my weight, and the windows reflected the darkening forest like black mirrors. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cool, the smell a mix of old wood and faint mildew. It was silent in a way that felt unnatural at first, like the air itself was holding its breath. I set my things down, ran through a quick check of the cabin, and made a mental note of the exits, just as I always did whenever I stayed somewhere new. As the first night settled, I made a small fire in the fireplace and prepared a simple dinner. The flames crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The sound was comforting, but also highlighted the silence beyond the cabin walls, which now felt immense, almost pressing in on me. The forest outside was dark, and every little sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the occasional distant bird call, seemed amplified. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the wilderness being itself. I ate slowly, listening. I had been alone in cabins before, and I knew how easily the mind could exaggerate ordinary noises into threats. After dinner, I cleaned up and went to check the windows before bed. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the trees looked like black towers in the night. As I turned back toward the fireplace, I thought I heard something. A soft crunching outside, near the back of the cabin. My heart jumped. I froze and listened. Nothing. Probably just an animal, I told myself. There were deer and raccoons in the area. I had seen tracks on the way in. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I double-checked the locks on the doors, slid the bolt on the back door, and made sure the windows were secure. I went to bed but slept fitfully. Every little noise from outside made me tense. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound I couldn't ignore. A soft tapping at the window beside my bed. I froze completely. My mind raced. Could it be a branch? It didn't sound like a branch. It was deliberate, repeated. I lay as still as I could, eyes wide open, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The tapping stopped. Minutes passed. I strained my ears, but the forest was quiet again, as if it hadn't happened at all. Sleep eventually claimed me, but in fragments, filled with uneasy dreams of shadows moving just beyond the tree line. Morning brought relief. Sunlight filtered through the trees and painted the cabin walls gold. I convinced myself that last night had been paranoia. The forest was harmless. I took a long walk around the property, noting animal tracks, the creek, and the thick underbrush. It was beautiful, peaceful, and I felt foolish for letting fear get the better of me. I spent the day chopping wood, exploring, and reading by the fireplace. By the evening, I had almost forgotten the tapping. But then it started again. This time, it was clearer. A slow, deliberate noise outside the cabin. Not just at the window, but around the back, moving slowly along the perimeter. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the door, trying to see through the gloom. Nothing. I called out, though I knew no one would answer. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and shadows. I saw movement too quick to be an animal. Something was circling the cabin. My stomach dropped. I wanted to leave, but the thought of walking down the dark road alone made my fear spike. I bolted the door, locked every lock, and sat in the corner of the cabin with the fireplace as a buffer of warmth and light. I held the flashlight across my lap, listening. Hours passed. Every sound made me jump. The soft crunch of leaves, the tapping on the siding, the occasional thud, always outside. I realized I had no idea who or what was out there. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a hunter, curious or hostile? A drifter? I had no phone signal. The nearest town was over 20 miles away. I was alone, and I had no way to call for help. By morning, I was exhausted, eyes raw from lack of sleep. The sun brought some comfort, but I knew I couldn't stay another night like the one I had just endured. I packed my essentials and prepared to leave, though I wanted to investigate the outside to understand what had happened. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something that froze my blood. Footprints in the soft earth behind the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, large, and fresh. Someone had been there overnight, walking all around the cabin, close enough to touch the walls. My heart raced. The prints led toward the forest, disappearing into the shadows between the trees. I debated leaving immediately or trying to figure out who it was. I grabbed my keys and started the car, leaving the cabin door unlocked but the windows shut. As I drove down the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Between the trees, I thought I saw a figure watching me, still standing where the footprints ended. Couldn't be sure. I drove faster, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Every bend in the road felt dangerous, every shadow a potential threat. When I reached the main highway, I called the local sheriff, explaining the situation and giving them the cabin's location. They told me they would send someone to check it out, though they warned that, often, tracks disappeared, and evidence was scarce in those forests. I drove to the nearest town, relieved to see other people, lights, signs of civilization. I stayed in a hotel that night, trying to convince myself that the cabin had been the source of my paranoia, that perhaps I had just been imagining someone outside. 3 days later, the sheriff called. They had found footprints, large and unmistakably human, circling the cabin. Nothing else. No one had been caught, no signs of forced entry, no belongings stolen. It seemed like whoever it was had been watching, maybe even testing me, then vanished into the forest as silently as they had arrived. The sheriff told me it wasn't uncommon. The area was isolated, and sometimes hunters or drifters wandered near cabins without warning. I never went back to that cabin. Looking back, I realized that the scariest part wasn't the tapping, the footsteps, or the feeling of being watched. It was the complete powerlessness. Being in that cabin, alone, with no way to reach anyone, knowing someone had been outside but not knowing who or why, it made every noise terrifying. Even now, years later, I can still hear the snap of a branch in the forest and feel that same tightening in my chest. I learned to respect the isolation, to never underestimate how vulnerable one can feel when alone in the wilderness. And though it ended safely, with me alive and unhurt, the experience left a mark. A permanent, cautious awareness of how easily the world can become threatening when you are truly alone. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. My work life had become a blur of screens, deadlines, and endless noise, and I was desperate for silence, for isolation, for a place where I could breathe without interruption. That's how I ended up in the mountains, a small cabin tucked into the thick of the forest, far from any roads, and nearly a day's hike from the nearest town. The cabin was advertised online as rustic but cozy, with running water, a wood-burning stove, and the kind of peace that could make you forget what day it was. I wanted that, needed that, even if it meant being completely alone for a week. The journey there was exhausting. I had carried my pack through rocky trails, climbed over fallen logs, and crossed a shallow creek that turned my boots to wet, heavy bricks. The sky had been pale when I left the trailhead, and by the time I arrived at the cabin, it was near dusk. The forest around me was dense, the kind that pressed on you from all sides, where every sound seemed amplified. The wind made the tree branches scrape and groan like giant, restless bodies, and every now and then, I could hear the faint crack of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods, as if something or someone was moving. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably a deer or the wind itself. The cabin was small but well-built. Logs stacked neatly, a tin roof with no visible holes, and a small porch that creaked under my weight as I set down my pack. The windows reflected the fading light, giving the place an empty, almost solemn look. I tried the door. It was stiff but opened, and inside, the air smelled of old pine and faintly of smoke from previous occupants. The stove was cold, the fireplace empty, and a single light bulb hung from the ceiling. There was a wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed in the corner, and shelves lined with dusty dishes and a few cans of food left behind by whoever had been here before. I unpacked my things slowly, methodically. I stacked firewood in the corner, filled the water jug from the sink, and set my sleeping bag on the bed. I tried to settle in, but there was a strange stillness in the air, a heaviness that felt like it was pressing down on me. The kind of quiet that wasn't just silence. It was waiting, patient, and unsettling. I decided to start a fire. The matches struck on the first try, and the kindling caught quickly. Flames licked at the dry wood, crackling and popping, and for a few minutes, I allowed myself to feel relief. The warmth spread through the cabin, the shadows dancing along the walls in time with the fire's flicker. I ate a simple dinner, a tin of beans I had carried with me, and then sat back, letting the silence settle around me. It wasn't until after the sun had fully set that I first noticed the sounds outside. Footsteps, I thought at first, though they were heavy and uneven, not like mine. I froze, listening. The sound came again, faint but distinct, from somewhere near the edge of the clearing around the cabin. My heart sped up, my body tensing, but I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, anything but a human. I had been alone in the woods many times, and I had learned to recognize the sound of wildlife. This didn't fit. I checked the windows. The forest was dark, black shadows that swayed with the movement of branches. The moon was thin, a crescent, barely lighting the clearing. The sound stopped, but then another began. A low, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the dirt. I felt a chill rise from the base of my spine. I kept the lights low and moved to the door, considering stepping outside, but the thought of going into that darkness, without a weapon, made me hesitate. I went back to the fire, trying to convince myself it was nothing, something natural, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Hours passed slowly. I dozed in the chair by the fire, waking repeatedly at small noises, a rustle of leaves, a distant snap of a branch. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, a human shape, crouched, almost blending with the trees. I held my breath, staring, heart thudding so loudly I thought it would give me away. When I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it had been my imagination, tired eyes playing tricks, but the fear didn't leave. Sleep came in fits. I woke several times during the night to strange sounds, closer now, as if whatever it was had circled the cabin. There was scratching at the walls, soft, deliberate, like nails or claws, then silence. My mind raced. Whoever or whatever was out there, I realized, wasn't the kind of person who just passed through. This was someone familiar with the forest, someone patient, waiting. By morning, I was exhausted, but I forced myself to get up. I checked the perimeter, walking the clearing as best I could. I found footprints, large and irregular, some human, some animal, crisscrossing the dirt. My stomach sank. There were no nearby roads, no other cabins visible, no obvious explanation. The forest felt different in daylight, less threatening, but the sense of being watched lingered. I decided to stay put during the day, gathering more firewood and fetching water from a small stream a few hundred feet away. Every time I left the cabin, I felt eyes on me, and every shadow seemed to twist into something threatening. I kept a large stick with me, not as a weapon but as a reassurance, something to hold. The second night was worse. The noises returned, louder, more deliberate. There was a knocking at the door, slow and measured. I stayed silent, huddled in the corner, listening as the knocking continued, then moved to the windows, tapping gently in some places, like someone testing my awareness. I didn't move. I didn't respond. The fire burned low, and I stared at it, imagining all the ways this could go wrong. I thought about the miles to the nearest town, the isolation, the impossibility of calling for help. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard breathing just beyond the door, slow and steady, not human, not quite animal. I gripped the stick until my hands ached, willing the night to end. Morning came again, painfully slow. I ventured outside, circling the cabin with careful, deliberate steps. The footprints had multiplied overnight, some close to the windows, some near the door. Whatever had been out there had moved around while I slept. I noticed that small objects I had left on the porch were shifted slightly, as if someone had touched them, adjusted them. Fear churned in my stomach. I realized I couldn't leave yet, but I also couldn't stay completely unprepared. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin. I stacked logs against the windows, locked the door as securely as I could, even wedging a chair under the handle. I set up tripwires using old wire I found in the shed, hanging cans from them to create noise if someone tried to approach. I sharpened the stick I had been carrying. Not that it would help much against someone stronger, but it was something. I also mapped the clearing, memorized the edges, the shadows, the places where someone could hide. I tried to convince myself I was being proactive, that preparation could turn fear into control. That night was the worst. The sounds outside were relentless, circling, scratching, knocking, dragging. At one point, a branch hit the window with enough force to crack the glass. I froze, heart hammering, realizing I had no choice but to defend myself if it came to that. I kept the fire burning, knowing that light was my only advantage. The shadow moved outside, pausing near the porch, silent for long stretches, then back to scratching and knocking. I didn't sleep at all. By the third day, my energy was nearly gone. I rationed food and water carefully, moving only to fetch supplies. I stayed inside as much as possible, always listening, always alert. The fear became constant, gnawing at my nerves, leaving me jumpy and exhausted. But I also started noticing patterns. The noises came at night, mostly from the north side of the cabin. The person or people outside seemed to test the cabin, then retreat. It was as if they were trying to gauge my reaction, waiting to see if I would leave or fight back. I realized I had two options: stay and hope for survival, or leave and risk being caught in the open. I couldn't leave. Not yet. The nearest road was miles away, and the forest was a maze. I had no map, no phone signal. Survival depended on patience and vigilance. That night, I made a decision. I stayed by the fire until it was almost out, then carried embers to the fireplace, piling logs to create a wall of fire between myself and the door. I set the cans on the tripwires, spread sharpened sticks near the windows, and settled in as best I could. The noises came as expected, but they stayed just outside, hesitant, wary. Hours passed. The fire burned bright. I waited. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear. I dozed lightly, never fully asleep, and when I woke, the forest was silent. The sun had risen. I stepped outside cautiously. The footprints were still there, but no one had approached while I slept. The sense of being watched lingered, but it was manageable. I stayed another day, still cautious, still alert. By the fourth night, the intrusions had stopped entirely. I didn't understand why. Perhaps whoever had been there gave up, or perhaps they had never intended to confront me directly. I didn't care. I used the morning light to hike back toward the road, keeping the cabin behind me, leaving the tripwires and fire setup as a deterrent for anyone else. When I reached the road, hours later, I felt relief I hadn't thought possible. I called the authorities, reported the strange activity, and then left the forest behind. I never returned to that cabin, never tried to understand what had happened, only remembering the fear and the meticulous focus it demanded. The experience stayed with me, a reminder of how vulnerable we are when isolated, how important preparation and vigilance can be, and how quickly quiet can turn into danger when someone is waiting and patient. Even months later, I still shiver when I imagine the forest at night, the shadows, the scratching and knocking, and the realization that for 3 nights, I was completely alone with someone or something that wanted to test me, to push me to the edge. And yet, in the end, I survived, not through luck, not through confrontation, but through careful planning, observation, and patience. That clarity, that understanding of what had kept me alive, stayed with me, a lesson I would never forget. I had always thought that isolation was something I could handle. I had spent years reading about survival, learning the basics of camping, hunting, and living in the wilderness. I had planned this trip for months, choosing a remote cabin I found listed online. It was small, made of rough timber, tucked deep in the woods, and far enough from the nearest road that no one would drive by unless they intended to. The pictures online showed a cozy interior, a wood stove, and a small loft. I had imagined myself there, completely alone, surrounded by trees, and finally free of the noise and pressure of the city. What I hadn't imagined was how much my mind could betray me when it was left alone with nothing but silence and shadows. The journey there was long. I drove through twisting roads that narrowed as the trees grew taller and denser. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in streaks, and the road became little more than dirt in places, dotted with deep ruts and small puddles. I kept my speed low, my eyes constantly scanning for signs of wildlife or other cars, though I saw none. After a couple of hours, I reached a small clearing where the cabin sat, almost hidden behind a row of tall pines. The structure was smaller than I expected, but sturdy. Its roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the wooden walls were weathered, gray from years of sun and rain. A small stack of firewood leaned against one side, partially covered with a tarp. I parked my car nearby and unloaded my gear. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. It wasn't just that there were no cars or people. It was the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds of birds and insects were muted, as if everything had paused to watch me. I brushed it off as the normal tension that came with being somewhere unfamiliar, and I focused on unpacking and setting up. I stacked some firewood, checked the stove, and explored the cabin. There was a single bedroom in the loft, a small kitchen area, and a narrow bathroom. The windows were old but intact, and the door had a sturdy latch. For now, it was perfect. As the sun dipped below the trees, shadows lengthened. I lit the stove and started boiling water for dinner. The sound of the fire popping and the smell of wood smoke were comforting, but there was also a sense of heaviness in the air, a weight that pressed down on me even though I was safe inside. I ate quickly, cleaned up, and settled in to read for a while. Night fell completely, and the forest outside turned into a wall of darkness. I went to the window and looked out, but I could see nothing beyond the faint outline of trees. Around midnight, I first heard it. A thump, soft but distinct, from outside. I froze. The wind was calm, and the trees were still. I waited, straining my ears. Another thump, followed by a dragging sound, like something being pulled across the forest floor. My heart rate picked up. I tried to convince myself it was a branch falling, or maybe a deer moving through the undergrowth, but the pattern didn't match anything natural. The sounds came in short bursts, slow and deliberate, and then stopped. I sat quietly, my stomach tight, waiting for more. Nothing. I told myself it was nothing, but sleep did not come easily. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, and the ground was uneven, covered with fallen branches and thick undergrowth. I walked slowly, taking in the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The air was fresh, but heavy, and every sound, my footsteps, the occasional bird, echoed oddly, making the forest feel larger and emptier than it really was. I noticed small signs that someone or something had passed through recently. Footprints that didn't look entirely like animal tracks, small disturbances in the underbrush. I felt uneasy, but I told myself I was overreacting. The wilderness is full of unexplained signs, and I was alone in it. That night, the sounds returned. Thumps and dragging noises again, but this time they seemed closer. I stayed awake for hours, eyes fixed on the window. I thought about going outside with a flashlight, but the idea of confronting whatever it was made me shiver. I realized that my first instinct had always been to control my surroundings, to observe and manage them, but here I had no control. The forest was vast and I was tiny and exposed. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I explored more during the day, marking trees and noting landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. I stocked up on firewood, and I kept the stove burning at night, not just for warmth but because the light and crackling noise gave me some comfort. The sounds outside persisted, though irregularly. Sometimes they would stop for a whole night, and sometimes they would start just as I was drifting off to sleep. I began noticing other things too. Scratches on the door frame, the way the soil near the cabin seemed disturbed in patterns I couldn't explain, and the feeling of being watched when I was outside. One afternoon, I found something that made my heart pound. While exploring a small path that led down to a creek, I discovered clear human footprints in the mud. They were fresh, probably no more than a day old, and they led in a circle back toward the cabin. I followed them cautiously, my stomach tight with fear, and they stopped just short of the clearing. There was no one there, nothing to see but trees and shadows. My mind raced. Who had been here? Were they still nearby? The realization hit me. I was not as alone as I had thought. I returned to the cabin and took extra precautions. I barricaded the door with a heavy chair, stacked firewood against the windows, and kept a knife close at hand. That night, the sounds were louder. Thumps, dragging noises, the occasional crack of a branch snapping under weight. Couldn't sleep at all. I sat in the loft, listening, trying to make sense of it. At one point, I thought I saw movement outside, a dark shape flitting between the trees, but it was gone before I could confirm. I stayed up until dawn, tense and exhausted. By the third night, the situation escalated. I woke to the sound of something scratching at the door, long, deliberate scratches that made the wood vibrate. My heart raced and I gripped the knife. The noises stopped suddenly, but I could hear breathing. Heavy, uneven, and coming from all around the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle taut, listening. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded with the approaching sunrise. I realized I was trapped in a nightmare, completely alone but under constant threat from something I couldn't see or predict. I spent the next day preparing for an emergency. I checked my phone, no signal. I gathered as much firewood as I could, made sure my knife was sharp, and found a thick branch to use as a weapon. I also made a plan. If someone tried to enter, I would climb to the loft and barricade myself. I rehearsed what I would do, over and over, running scenarios in my head. The thought of leaving the cabin terrified me too. The forest had become a labyrinth, and I didn't know who or what might be watching from the shadows. That night, the sounds changed. No longer just thumps or scratches, but movement around the perimeter of the cabin. I could hear someone or something walking slowly, deliberately, circling the building. I held my breath, every nerve screaming. The hours passed slowly. At one point, the branch I had prepared as a weapon moved slightly in my hand. I realized I was shaking. I forced myself to stay calm. I had to wait for a clear opportunity, a moment when I could act decisively. Finally, at dawn, I heard movement retreating into the forest. I didn't wait to see more. I waited until the sun was fully up, the light spilling across the clearing. Then I moved quickly. I grabbed my backpack, my knife, and whatever I could carry, and I ran. I didn't follow trails or paths. I just ran toward the light, toward open areas where I could see far ahead. I ran until I found a logging road, where I flagged down a truck that happened to be passing. The driver called the local authorities, and I explained what had happened as best as I could. They searched the area, but they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone hiding, nothing except the disturbed soil near the cabin. The experience left me shaken, but it also taught me something important. Isolation is dangerous, not just because of the wilderness itself, but because of the unpredictability of other people. I realized that even in the most carefully chosen, remote places, you are never truly safe from human presence. I learned to respect the forest, not just for its beauty, but for its silence, its emptiness, and its ability to conceal both life and danger. In the weeks that followed, I recovered physically, but the memory of those nights stayed with me. I kept thinking about what could have happened if I had fallen asleep or panicked. I learned to trust my instincts more, to prepare for every possibility, and to never underestimate the power of fear in an isolated place. Eventually, I returned to the cabin during the day with other people. Together, we explored the area safely, and I found no signs of anyone ever being there during my first trip. It was a relief, but also a reminder that sometimes fear is real even when the danger is invisible. I never stayed alone in that cabin again, and I never will. The memory of those nights, the sounds, the shadows, the feeling of being hunted, has never left me. Even now, years later, whenever I see a remote cabin listed online, I pause and think about the silence, the isolation, and the invisible presence that once made me feel completely powerless. I have learned to respect that feeling, to acknowledge it, and to remember that caution, preparation, and awareness are what keep you alive when the forest seems empty but never truly is. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months. My work had been crushing me for weeks, leaving me drained, and the idea of escaping into the woods for a few days felt like the only chance I had to breathe. I picked a cabin in a remote area deep in the mountains. The online photos showed a rustic, but well-kept wooden structure, surrounded by tall pine trees, perched on the edge of a small clearing. The cabin had a small deck and large windows that overlooked a narrow creek, and it was far enough from the main road that I would have the forest almost entirely to myself. The thought of no one around, no phones ringing, no emails was intoxicating. I arrived in the late afternoon. The drive had been long and winding, narrow mountain roads with no guardrails. The trees pressing close on either side, shadows stretching across the road as the sun began to sink behind the ridges. By the time I reached the turnoff to the cabin, I had no cell signal. The lack of connectivity both excited and unnerved me. I parked my car at the edge of the clearing, grabbed my backpack, and walked up the small dirt path to the cabin. The forest around me was quiet in that sort of deep, natural silence that city people never hear. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant gurgle of the creek. The cabin itself was exactly like the photos. Weathered wood, sturdy roof, but unmistakably isolated. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of pine and old wood, with a hint of dust. The interior was simple but functional. A small kitchen area with a propane stove, a dining table, a living space with a few chairs, and a loft with a mattress. There was a stack of firewood in one corner and an old wood stove in the center of the main room. I set my backpack down, ran my hand over the rough wooden surfaces, and for a moment just stood there absorbing the stillness. I unpacked some of my food and water, then made a small fire in the stove. The heat began to chase the chill out of the cabin, and the orange glow made the walls and ceiling feel warmer, almost alive. I sat on the edge of the mattress for a while, looking out the window at the creek below, watching the water slip between the rocks, reflecting the last light of day. By the time darkness fully fell, the forest outside had become an almost impenetrable black. The trees swayed gently with the evening wind, and their shadows moved across the cabin walls. The isolation that had seemed freeing in daylight suddenly felt more pressing at night. I decided to explore the surrounding area before it got too dark. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The moon was rising, thin and pale, barely cutting through the dense canopy. The air smelled damp, earthy, and alive with the sense of moss and decaying leaves. I walked toward the creek, my flashlight sweeping over rocks and tree roots. The sound of the water was louder now, more insistent, echoing slightly off the surrounding trees. As I moved deeper into the clearing, I noticed something unusual. Fresh footprints in the soft mud near the creek. They were human, adult-sized, and definitely recent. My stomach tightened. The area was supposed to be empty. No one else should have been here. I followed the footprints a little further, and they led toward the woods. I shone my flashlight among the trees, but saw nothing. Unease started to creep in. I had been alone so far, enjoying the quiet, and now the reality of being in a completely isolated place with someone or something else around was sinking in. I returned to the cabin quickly, locking the door behind me, checking the windows. Everything seemed secure. I tried to calm myself by telling myself that it was probably a hiker or someone else staying nearby. Still, the thought lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to spend the rest of the evening inside, keeping the fire going. I checked my supplies, made sure I had enough water and food for the next day. I even checked the firewood stack, making sure it was full enough to last the night. I sat near the stove, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every snapping twig outside made me tense. The wind rustled the trees, and for a moment I thought I heard a faint crunching sound on the porch. I froze, holding my breath, but when I flicked the flashlight toward the door, nothing was there. My mind tried to rationalize it, probably just a branch falling. I kept the fire alive and stayed near it for hours, my eyes scanning the windows, my ears straining to catch anything unusual. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I dozed, a new sound would wake me. A rustle in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the scrape of branches against the cabin walls. Around 3 in the morning, I finally dozed into a light, uneasy sleep, sitting on the mattress with the flashlight still in reach. I woke suddenly to a noise, a deliberate knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. It was loud, firm, and deliberate. Not the wind, not an animal. I froze. The cabin had only one main door, and the windows were locked. Whoever it was would know I was inside. I debated what to do. The logical part of me wanted to hide, stay silent, and see if they went away. But then I realized I needed a plan. I grabbed the baseball bat I had brought for emergencies, kept it close, and approached the door cautiously. The knocking came again, louder this time. I could see shadows moving just beyond the window. My pulse was hammering. I stepped back, trying to think clearly. The cabin had no phone line, and I had no signal. I was completely cut off. I remembered the car, my only link to civilization. If I could get to it and start the engine, I might be able to scare whoever it was off or at least escape. But the path to the car was open and exposed. Whoever was outside would see me immediately. I debated waiting, hoping whoever it was would leave. But another loud knock shattered that idea. I gathered my courage, opened the door slowly, and shone the flashlight out into the night. A man stood there, tall, wearing dark clothes that blended into the shadows. His face was hidden beneath a hood. My first instinct was to swing the bat, but something in his posture made me hesitate. He didn't move forward, but just stood there, staring. I backed into the cabin and slammed the door, locked it, and ran to the loft. I grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher and some canned food, feeling ridiculous but desperate. The knocking continued, rhythmic, like someone trying to break my composure. I moved through the cabin quietly, trying to make as little noise as possible. Hours passed. I stayed in the loft, flashlight ready, listening. The knocking finally stopped just as dawn began to break. I waited a long while before venturing down. Outside, there were no signs of anyone. No footprints, no lingering shadow. The forest looked normal, peaceful even. I couldn't stay. The experience had shaken me to the core. I packed everything quickly, leaving only a small note in the cabin to explain that I had to leave due to a personal emergency. I walked down the path to my car, checking over my shoulder constantly. When I finally got inside the vehicle, I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove off. The winding mountain roads seemed endless, but I didn't care. I kept going until I reached an area with cell service and could call for help if necessary. The weeks that followed were difficult. I couldn't stop replaying the night in my mind, trying to rationalize it, wondering who or what had been outside. But eventually, I realized that some encounters are meant to be survived, not understood. I never returned to that cabin, and I made sure to tell friends to never underestimate the remoteness of wilderness and the people who might lurk there. The forest is beautiful, quiet, and mesmerizing, but it is also unpredictable, and human nature adds a layer of danger no one should ignore. I learned that isolation can be both liberating and terrifying, and that sometimes survival is about courage, planning, and trusting your instincts, even when everything feels overwhelming. The cabin still exists, probably rented out to someone else now. The experience left me wary but also determined. I now prepare more carefully, travel in pairs, and never ignore the signs of human presence around a remote location. That night taught me the stark reality that danger is not always obvious, and safety is a constant, conscious effort. I survived, and I left with a heightened sense of awareness, respect for the wilderness, and the knowledge that sometimes A scary night is just that. A night to endure, survive, and learn from. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. It was a small, isolated cabin up in the mountains, far away from any towns or neighbors. I wanted to get away from everything: work, people, noise, and just be alone in the woods. The idea of being completely cut off, with nothing but the trees, the air, and myself had seemed peaceful. It had seemed like the perfect escape. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies to last several days. I brought extra batteries, a first aid kit, a strong flashlight, and a small stove for cooking. I even packed a hand crank radio and some matches just in case. I drove for hours, the road twisting and turning through the mountains. Eventually, the paved road ended, replaced by a rough dirt path that wound between dense trees. The last mile was barely passable. Rocks and roots tore at my tires, and I had to drive slowly, carefully, inch by inch, until I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was smaller than I expected, more like a large shed than a home. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. There was a small porch, just enough for 2 chairs, and a rusty metal railing that looked like it might collapse if you leaned on it too heavily. The windows were dirty, streaked with years of dust and rain. I parked my car nearby and stepped out, letting the air hit me. It smelled of pine, damp soil, and cold. I could hear a creek nearby, gurgling over rocks, and the wind rustling through the tall firs. For a moment, I felt a rush of excitement. This was exactly what I wanted. I carried my things inside. The cabin had a single room with a small kitchen area, a table, and a wood stove. A loft above served as a sleeping area. The floor creaked under my weight, and the smell of old wood and mold was strong. I unpacked my food and supplies, stacking them neatly in the corners. The stove was cold, but the chimney looked intact, so I started a small fire to warm the place. The fire flickered, casting shadows on the walls, and the warmth made the cabin feel less like a forgotten shack and more like a temporary home. I sat down at the table with a cup of water, just listening to the wind and the creek. The first night passed quietly. I slept on the loft, wrapped in my sleeping bag, and woke up the next morning to birdsong and a weak sunlight filtering through the dirty windows. Everything seemed normal, peaceful. The second day, I decided to explore the area. There was a trail that led into the woods, though it was more like a path made by animals than a proper hiking trail. I followed it for a few hours, noticing animal tracks, broken branches, and the occasional fallen tree. I saw deer tracks, rabbit holes, and even the marks of a large predator, maybe a bear, though I never saw it. The woods were dense, quiet, and strangely empty. By mid-afternoon, I turned back, my legs sore from climbing over rocks and roots. The cabin looked small and fragile in the middle of the towering trees. That evening, I cooked a simple meal and sat by the fire, reading from a small notebook I had brought. The wind picked up outside, making the walls creak, and I thought I heard branches tapping against the roof. But I told myself it was just the wind. The third day is when I started to notice something wrong. I went to refill my water from the creek, a small spring-fed stream about a quarter mile from the cabin. I had brought my water filter, and I set to work filling bottles and purifying the water. As I worked, I heard a rustling in the underbrush nearby. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, moving slowly. I could not see anything at first, just the dense trees. It was the sound of someone or something walking carefully, almost stalking. My heart began to race. I grabbed my backpack and headed back to the cabin, quickening my pace, glancing over my shoulder repeatedly. The sound of footsteps seemed to follow me, always stopping when I stopped, always moving when I moved. By the time I reached the cabin, my hands were shaking. I locked the door and sat near the stove, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a bear, or maybe a neighbor passing on the road below, though it was unlikely. That night, sleep came fitfully. Every sound made me tense. A branch tapping the window, the wind rattling the roof, even my own breathing. I kept my flashlight and my knife next to me on the loft. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, soft footsteps outside the cabin. They moved slowly around the perimeter, stopping and starting. The cabin was small, and the floorboards below me groaned under the weight of something or someone. I could see faint shadows through the thin curtains. I stayed perfectly still, listening, heart pounding so hard I thought it might break my ribs. The footsteps stopped suddenly. Silence. Then a slow scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy along the ground. My stomach turned. I stayed frozen until the first light of dawn, when the sounds finally ceased. I spent the entire fourth day inspecting the cabin. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure the locks worked. I reinforced weak spots with pieces of wood I found outside. I cleared a small area around the cabin to give myself a better view of anyone approaching. I also made a plan. If someone or something tried to enter, I would have time to see them and respond. I started keeping a fire burning all day for warmth and as a signal, though I knew the smoke might also draw attention. That afternoon, I went to the creek again, carrying a heavy stick as a precaution. The woods felt different this time, heavier, tense, like they were watching me. I did not see any movement, but the tracks near the creek were fresh. Human footprints, small ones like from a teenager or a thin adult. They were scattered, as if someone had been walking slowly, almost carefully, and then had run. I followed them a short distance but stopped when I realized they led deeper into the woods and farther from the cabin. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and began to consider leaving. That night was the worst. Around 11 p.m., I heard a loud banging on the cabin door. My heart stopped. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, my mind racing. The banging continued, heavy and erratic. I moved to the window, shining the light outside, but I could not see anyone. The woods were dark and thick. Then I heard movement on the porch, the scraping of shoes against wood. I realized someone was trying to break in. My first thought was to stay hidden, to wait for them to go. But I knew that if they got in, I would have very little chance. I considered my options. My car was parked just a few dozen meters away, but getting to it would mean crossing the open clearing. The thought terrified me. I stayed put, flashlight in hand, knife ready, listening as the banging stopped and started again. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Silence returned, heavy and thick. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, I saw the damage. The door had deep scratches and gouges, as if someone had tried to force it open with a tool or a sharp object. The lock was intact, but the scratches were fresh. I checked the windows. They were undisturbed. I realized I could not stay there alone anymore. I packed quickly, leaving most of my supplies behind. I wanted to leave quietly, without alerting whoever had been outside. I stuffed my pack with essentials, making sure I had water, food, and my first aid kit. I left the fire smoldering to make it look like I had been asleep. I walked carefully to the car, glancing over my shoulder constantly. The woods were quiet, but I knew it was deceptive. I drove slowly down the dirt road, listening for any signs of pursuit. The car rattled over the rocks, tires kicking up dust. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see someone running after me, but there was no one. I reached the paved road, heart pounding, and felt the first wave of relief. I drove straight to the nearest gas station, called the police, and reported what had happened. They took my statement seriously and sent patrols to the area, though I knew there was little they could do in the thick, isolated woods. In the days after, I realized just how dangerous isolation could be. The wilderness, which had seemed so peaceful, had hidden a very real threat. Someone else with the knowledge of the area and the intention to scare or harm. I learned to respect the solitude of nature, to understand that being alone does not mean being safe. I never returned to that cabin. Weeks later, I read in a local news report that a teenager and 2 accomplices had been arrested for breaking into cabins in the area, including mine. They had been responsible for several incidents of trespassing and theft. The authorities recovered some of the items I had left behind, and the case was resolved. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease. I was unharmed, but the memory of the dark woods, the banging on the door, and the footsteps outside stayed with me. Since then, I have traveled to remote areas less often and always with others. I learned to take isolation seriously, to plan for every possible risk, and to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. The mountains were beautiful, but I realized that beauty could be deceptive. Nature is not inherently dangerous, but humans can be. I had wanted peace and solitude, and I got it, but I also got fear and vulnerability. In the end, I was lucky. I survived the experience and learned a lesson I would never forget. Even now, whenever I see a cabin in the woods, I feel a shiver, a reminder that the forest can hide more than just wildlife. It can hide people and intentions we do not understand. And that is a fear that never truly goes away.